Gentlemen, how are we doing, gentlemen? Oh, he's straight with the shades today. He's set. He's set. Javier, Cadell, how are we doing today? Good. The internet is not working upstairs, so I've migrated downstairs. And different things. So dusting, I'm really interested in that. I have a few questions. So I'm quite taken by this idea. Is dusting? So hey, good to see you, Hunter Coates. Good to see you. Oh, we're talking
What's
about dusting.
up?
Yeah, we're doing fine, sir. I'm about to talk about dusting for a minute. We
Yeah.
just had a conversation with Mr. Boothby, who's magnificent. His book Blown Away is also really, really good. So there's a few things. So I'm very interested when he's talking about the dusting as the unknown of the other, where you come upon them and there's this kind of unknown. So to me, I'm always interested by the anxiety of encountering the other because they might throw you in a world that you cannot escape. Like if somebody comes up to you, for example, and pushes you in front of a car, then you forever must live in a world where you can't walk, for example, right? There's also the fear of, say, marrying someone, and what if they get cancer, and then you have to you have no choice but to live through the suffering of losing that person, right? And it's almost like what I'm curious is if the dusting versus the real, because I associate the real, I know you said this, Cadell, as kind of a thwarting of desire. Like it's whenever your desire is thwarted, right? Like you're trying to get on the taxi, you're trying to get somewhere, and the real is you can't, it doesn't work out that way, right? Well, what's interesting there, so is that the real seems to, you have to have a desire ahead of time.
I've always said I remember I just had this flashback of, to me, the real is always the opposite of your desire.
Mm, mm, mm. No, I think that's very succinct. And the difference there, because I really am very curious about this difference between the real and the dusting, and then I'll give it to Hunter Coates, is this idea that with the real, you know your desire, you have it kind of ahead of time, and then you hit something that thwarts it. Where with the dusting, is it something where you don't know what the other will do to you, but you know that what they could do to you, you won't want it, whatever it might be. So, for example, the other may show up and call you an a-hole, and now you have no choice but to deal with a world in which you're confronting someone calling you an a-hole, and you didn't know that you didn't want to be in that world where you're confronting that, but now you must. And the reason I also bring up this example is because in reading where he's talking about Dr. Boothberry, his son's suicide, so much of the idea is I am now forced in a situation I cannot escape. I cannot go back to a world where my son has not committed suicide. And I am like, it's like you're stuck in a prison and they lock the key and they throw it away, right? Like you're forced to experience this now. And I associate the dusting, if we take his interpretation of the dusting, is this zone of possibility of being thrown into something that then once you're in, you cannot get out of. Whereas the real seems like it's more prepared almost. Like you're able to think about your desire. You're able to pursue
To
your
me, to
object.
me, to me, to me, Dawes Ding is like a black hole.
Mm, mm. No, I like that image because it's like someone throws you into a black hole and now you can't get out of it. You're being sucked into a world where your
That's
son has
what a black
committed
hole is.
suicide. Yeah, no, I think I find this really interesting. And then I'll pass it to Mr. Coates and then Javier. It's like the opposite of that seems to be in that same book. He talks about the psychedelic experience where then you didn't know ahead of time and then you're thrown into this world where you see everything differently, right? And is that the same sort of unknown? Is that the same zone of possibility? Is it different? What are the differences? What are the contours? I find this I'm not saying they're equivalent, but there's a similar
I,
sort
I
of
think, there was a clip that you had with Samuel Barnes when he recorded it at your house.
mm,
There was a moment where he was asking about psychedelics.
yes.
And I think what psychedelics do is they're an active confrontation with Dawes Ding.
Mm,
But like that they might help you prepare. That's why sometimes psychedelics are saying to maybe help people like Richard Boothby who have been blown away.
mm. So it seems like there might be a difference between the where you're preparing for dusting versus thrown in to dusting. And then you could also talk about mysticism, different things. No, it's fascinating. And then also can you engage in Buber's waiting without a vulnerability to the dusting, as Javier talks about. It seems like if you want something to be a thou instead of an it, you have to be so vulnerable to the unknown of the other. But let me give it to Mr. Coates and then Javier. Mr. Coates, good to see you today, sir. I hope that you are doing well.
Yeah, so hello everyone. I'm happy to talk about the difference between the real and dusting. So the way that I tend to think about it is, so dusting would be something like this mythical unity that like never really existed, and it's like this persisting myth kind of that like tracks with the subject. Now, the real is something more in terms of a Hegelian sense would be like it it is due to the symbolic kind of overcoding itself. A common example that I like to use, I think I used this in my conspiracy book or whatever. I think I said where let's say you go in for a hug and the other person like goes in for a handshake, right? So the real has come in at the sense because you've both engaged in this colloquial gesture, but the real has invaded, not because the real was already lying there, but because through the failure of the symbolic, the real broke through. This is a very Zizekian take on it. Now, you can do a more Lacanian take, less Zizekian. By Lacan tended to associate the real with a with particularly a pre-Oedipal stage. So before the introduction of the name of the father, before the acceptance of the law, there was the pre-Oedipal stage, which would be like this mythical wholeness before the subject realizes that they are disconnected from the mother. Because they I know Melanie Klein talked about how like the inner world of the subject is wholly and totally confined to the mother when they're an infant. So you would say that before the mirror stage, before the name of the father, whatever term you want to use in the subject's psychological development, there was this mythical unity that was never really there, but the subject never realized it wasn't there because they were always believing that they were still tied to the mother in this mythical unity. So that's kind of what the real is from a Zizekian Lacanian stance. Now, dusting. So I actually was writing on this today. Particularly, I was writing about the use of dusting in Kant with Sade's, with the essay on equity Kant with Sade. And what I was talking about was particularly where jouissance is said to be a barrier in itself to dusting. It's a barrier, it's the fantasy is created, and then the barrier that sustains the subject's protection against dusting is itself jouissance. Now, this is a very Kantian understanding, kind of dusting is in the noumena, you can say. But what I kind of saw this as, at least the essay that I'm writing, is tying this into Christian theology. So what I took it as was the dusting is like the ever-persisting God, and that the subject creates this barrier of jouissance, which would be the introduction of worldly pleasures and a turn away from spiritual life. And then the subject engages with that as a barrier in itself against coming to the traumatic truth of God existing. So yeah, I'm done.
Thank you for saying that, Hunter. I'll give it to Javier. And no, I like that idea of going in for the hug and they go for the handshake, because I had that happen the other day in that awkward moment of going, oh, hey, yeah, that sort of thwarting of desire. And it is very interesting because Boothby was also kind of describing that the dusting is simultaneously this kind of realm of frightening possibility, but also the realm of the surprise that makes life worth living, right? And there's always this kind of double thing where people, and he was making the point as well, that we don't really experience a tree with anxiety, right? We don't, when we see a deer coming up in the forest, we don't feel this sort of nervousness. But when a human's coming up in the forest, oh, that changes the whole situation, right? The appearance of the human is precisely the appearance of this unknown that is coming forth, and who knows what could be there, what could occur. And then it's interesting because maybe they're a disclosure of some sort of revelation, maybe some sort of terror. It's sort of navigating that space that the person brings with them. But let me give it to Javier. Mr. Javier Rivera, I hope you're doing well.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot here, and it's going to be hard for me to tackle this because I'm not always familiar with Lacanian terminology or Kantian. But I would like to approach dusting in the context. I would like to try to think dusting and the real in the context of love, because I think that might actually be helpful. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the way we've been describing dusting, at least the way I've been grabbing from Cadell, is that love itself is like already a black hole in some sense. Like you realize, when you realize that you're in love, you've already been in the black hole. This is like a sort of post hoc rationalization of you being in love. But the real, this is where I want to think more about this in relation and to the context of love, because I think it's this brief emergence of I think it has something to do with the breaking of that post rationalization, where it's like I didn't expect myself to love this person. I didn't foresee myself liking this person like ever, right? So this is where I'm trying to think, because it does seem like Cadell says, like if the real is kind of this thwarting of desire, then the black hole has already thwarted desire, but we didn't know it was thwarted, right? And so this is where I feel like perhaps when we start thinking about Das Ding, and the real, I want to use the terms that we talked about before, Daniel, where I would say Das Ding is more like, I don't want to say event, but then real would be the eventing, where it's like, now you have to deal with the fact that you are already in love, right? That you didn't expect this thwarting of desire to occur. And so now you're grappling with the fact that I love this person. I can't help but love this person. And I didn't expect to love this person. So I really think when we talk about love, it can be helpful in connecting what we talk about with Das Ding and real, if I'm using the definitions that were kind of presented here. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
No, I appreciate that. And it is a fascinating topic. So, a few things come to mind. I like that idea as well, that it's like the event versus the eventing. And there is almost like, I do wonder, kind of based on what Boothby is saying, and I appreciate what Coates was saying as well, is there a way in which all Das Ding entails encountering the real, but not all encountering the real entails Das Ding? Would the real be kind of possible without Das Ding? Because I guess, so for example, if I make a difference between the real of, I thought Michelle wanted to have a tomato sandwich for lunch, and then I make it, and it turns out that she actually wanted a ham sandwich, and I have to confront the real that I'm not a very good listener. That does not seem the same as the Das Ding of the possibility of something today occurring that I don't even know could occur, an unknown. So for example, Michelle gets sick. Right? Oh, well, I didn't know. And then you have to suddenly have your life be a thing that deals with this reality that's completely unexpected of Michelle getting sick. That entails the kind of real, right? This kind of breaking through. I did not desire to have a day where the real came up. I desire to instead maybe go pick those tomatoes because I like tomato sandwiches or something. And now you cannot do it. So there's a thwarting of desire. But it's different from the desire of, oh, I think this tomato is going to be the greatest tomato ever, the object, and then you get it and it turns out it's not, right? Like there's some sort of surprise element of the coming forth of the Das Ding that seems to be a kind of breaking through of the real, but it is maybe different in the experience of kind of an expectation that is thwarted. Because I feel like the Das Ding is always on the periphery, almost. It's almost like it's always there, possibly it's under everything and it breaks through. And I mean, he was talking about social media, and then I'll give it to Hunter Coates. Like if I think about Given's belonging again, basically Given's, like if the society was Christian, it was given that the Christian worldview is true. And please note, very important, that it was never actually given because of the Gödel incompleteness. You never had certainty, right? But you had a sense of givenness that kept you from a direct encounter with the Das Ding, if you will. Then the breaking down of that givens forces you to kind of confront this sort of unknown space that leads to all sorts of anxiety that people can respond to badly. And so likewise, when you lose the shared intelligibility of, say, Christianity, within Christianity, you can have confronting of the real, where your idea of what you thought the church should be turns out not to be what the church is actually like, but you're still able to assume, say, the shared intelligibility of Christianity. But then maybe later on, you get where the givenness of Christianity is gone as well, and now it's like the Das Ding is breaking through too with the real. I'm not sure if that's the case, but it seems like there's different kind of levels there. And again, I can't claim either to be an expert in the language, Javier, so I completely understand. And that's why everyone needs to take Cadell's course that is coming up on the Acree starting in September on Philosophy Portal Online. So that's why it will be so valuable for all of us. But let me give it to Mr. Hunter Coates. Mr. Hunter Coates, please.
What we're talking about the difference between Das Ding and the real. It's important to know that these two terms in Lacan's corpus did not come about at the same time. The real kind of came about in, I believe, Seminar 3. So this was about the early 1950s. Das Ding was only introduced in Seminar 7. So we're talking 1962, 63. So there is a real without the Das Ding in terms of psychoanalysis. And after the seminar on ethics that Lacan did in 1962, the real, Das Ding was used much less. It was kind of used once. It was used for an ethical purpose, and then it was kind of tossed away. There's a couple of essays in Acree from 67, which have Das Ding, like again, the Kant with Sod essay, but most of the time, Das Ding's kind of thrown away. The way Zizek explains it is that it was Lacan's Kantian phase, and after Lacan went through his Kantian phase, he went through his Hegelian phase. And the Hegelian phase is the later version of the real for Zizek. Now, I think in terms of what we can do with this term, regardless of what happened with Lacan and him throwing it away, I think Das Ding can be used as that kind of like that unknown known, that unknown unknown you were talking about. There was in my analytic metaphysics course I took like last year, there was this circle they drew, and the circle had different inner circles in it, and it was like a known known, an unknown known, a known unknown, and then an unknown unknown. Those are like as you're getting more into abstract. And I think an unknown unknown would be something like, what is the end of the world? When does the end of the world happen? I think it's so out of the ordinary. And this is why I think Lacan talks about it in terms of ethics, right? We construct these ethical systems in order to guard us from the unknown unknown. End of the world, nuclear annihilation. Well, even that would be a known unknown. So not even nuclear annihilation, just the question, when will the world end? Will it end? That would be an unknown unknown for Lacan, and that would be the Das Ding that we're trying to guard ourselves of. That would be a mythical unity that we can think about, but it's always going to be out there that we do not want to confront. So I think that's it.
To explain that very well. And indeed, Mr. Boothby, I think what you went through is very good. Mr. Boothby was indeed noting how Das Ding is a concept that's mentioned not very often in Lacan, and for him it's a really rich concept that he thinks needs to be brought out, and he's speaking about it. Indeed, it to me resonates with that sort of unknown unknown. And then it's kind of curious, because there's almost a way in which if you encounter the real and it thwarts your desire, there's still at least enough known to know that your desire has been thwarted, like that the framework is almost still in place by which the real and the thwarting of desire is sensible. And as the Das Ding sort of cracks in the entire framework, where then maybe the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary all blur because they're no longer sensible. Now I'm being a little out there, but when I think of a black hole, I think about everything getting sucked in. And if everyone has seen Oppenheimer, because I did have the pleasure of seeing that movie, oh my gosh, that entire movie is about sex. Happy to talk about why I think that that movie is about sexuality. If
I would be very interested to hear.
Oh, I'd love to talk about that, because the whole thing is about sex, but I don't want to ruin it for anyone.
Please expand.
Yeah, maybe Cadell and I will have to have a talk, because that movie was actually brilliant.
I saw the movie too.
Oh, you did? Hunter Coates, have you
I've seen it.
Oh,
We've all
yes!
seen it.
Yes! All right, so everyone, I'm going to let Javier speak, but actually I think Oppenheimer is perfect for the Das Ding reel. And I think the whole movie is about sexuality. So in about 5 minutes or so, we're going to start talking about Oppenheimer, because I think the entire movie is about sex.
I love theories of physicists and sex.
I think the whole movie is about sex, actually. But I will give my thesis. I actually ended up writing like a 20-page paper this morning because I couldn't help myself. But anyway, Javier. So anyway, Das Ding creation, Oppenheimer nukes. What do you say?
Okay, so just before I go into Oppenheimer, I think Buber is kind of helpful for me to think through this, because Buber always talks about how any event with the thou kind of collapses into an it. But then Buber talks about how like there's this, this is the melancholic kind of reality of our lives, that it always collapses back into an it. And it makes me wonder if Das Ding and the real in a maybe Buberian context is more like, you need the real, the real doesn't guarantee a movement towards Das Ding. But I think what Das Ding can do is it can help you have a better relation to the real. And this is something that I'm speculating, because I'm obviously functioning from like a sort of Buber framework of the way he sets up it and thou, but it does make me wonder that yes, you can have real without Das Ding. That's absolutely possible. I agree with that. Um, but I think if you don't have some type of non-object or object of attention like Das Ding, I don't think we can understand our relationship to the real or have a better relation to the real. Because then it just becomes what we don't want to happen, essentially, you know. Um, whereas you can sort of have a sort of turning towards dusting, but it doesn't guarantee that you will encounter dusting. You know what I mean? And then this is how Buber talks about it too. It doesn't guarantee that you will encounter the thou, but you can put yourself in a sort of mode of being that you can possibly encounter it. And I think that framework can help me think that maybe dusting is there in a sense to be a kind of thing of attention for us to have a better relation to the real. If there is this disjunction, then I don't know what the real will do to me without this dusting, kind of, without this conception of dusting. Now, the Oppenheimer, to go into Oppenheimer, I thought it was really funny that I went with my two best friends and they were critiquing the movie. They're saying that they saw it was completely pointless to have the sex scene, which they were shocked when I expressed my opinion about it. I said I thought it was, basically pivotal. Like I thought I thought really the most beautiful parts of the movie was that exact scenario of sex and death, and to me it just sort of depicted the whole movie after that, where Oppenheimer is ironically he's distancing himself from what he's discovered. Basically, he doesn't want to claim responsibility for it, and yet it haunts him. Ironically, I feel like, and this is where he talks about, like, when they're questioning him, and he goes, well, they say, well, you did change your mind about the atomic bomb, right? And he says, well, I just simply presented the scientists' views, right? Like they keep trying to get him to, like, commit to some sense of, like, yes, you did change your mind. And he's like, no, I mean, yes, but also I just simply presented the ideas. And it's the same way that he talks about the bomb, where he's like, we make the bomb, we don't decide who drops it. Basically, we don't decide how they use it. So he's constantly distancing himself, and yet this distancing is also the very thing that kind of destroys him. And it's the same thing with the woman, the sort of woman that's sort of outside the frame that his wife doesn't know about, right, until later. And it comes to haunt him too, because he sort of just continuously distances himself from her because she is part of the Communist Party and so on. But I don't know. I feel like those are kind of rooms or areas to talk about and think through.
So I haven't been to see a movie since actually Dunkirk, because the only movies I go to the theaters to see are Christopher Nolan, and everything else I don't really care about. I didn't get to go see Tenet because alas, it was during the pandemic. So I think quite highly of Christopher Nolan, and I think also Christopher Nolan tends to be thematically brilliant. It is not so first off, spoilers. If there is a sex scene in a Christopher Nolan film, it is going to be thematically important. And I wish Andrew Luber was here, because he's an expert, him and Alex, on screenwriting. And the thematic command by which I think organizes the entire movie is the don't let your desire for release set a chain of events that you will not want to own. So there's this idea. So first of all, there's the obvious example of the sex scene where he's reading the famous "I am the destroyer of worlds." And then when the nuke goes off at Trinity, which is a phallic symbol with the tower, that it blows up, it goes all silent, there's no music, and you just hear the breathing, which of course sounds like the breathing in the bunker, but it could actually be the breathing of the sex scene. And then they repeat, "I am the destroyer of worlds," right? Also, it should be noted, the feeling, it would seem in the sex scene as well, that Oppenheimer does not actually reach finality in the sexual act, that it's stopped before the orgasm, right? Well, that doesn't occur until actually the nuclear bomb goes off. And what you see also throughout this idea of, oh, we did all this work for the Manhattan Project, and you see the women, the female at the head is like, we should stop the project now. There's no need to go to completion, right? And there's this kind of idea of it being a sexual act and experimental science that doesn't actually finish itself. And we, as the viewer as well, are kind of like, no, don't abort it. We want to see the bomb go off, right? But if the bomb goes off, because you don't want all that work and build up to go to nothing, then you set off a chain of reaction that you can no longer stop, right? With the unbelievable final line of the movie. I would argue that Oppenheimer is using the real to avoid Dall-E, actually, and that it's not until the very end that there's an acknowledgement that actually the methods of avoiding the real could lead to the Dall-E breaking through, ergo the end of the world. So the reason why that movie is fascinating for this conversation, because actually Oppenheimer uses martyrdom and real to frankly avoid accepting his responsibility for the possible eclipsing of the Dall-E. There are other moves. So, for example, where Emily Blunt doesn't give the handshake at the end, she constantly blames Oppenheimer. Why'd you shake their hand? Why they shake their hand? The male cannot help in the movie, but always look for release. He's looking to get out of the tension between his friends. So shake the hands, kind of boil it over. Where the Emily Blunt, actually, by not shaking the hand, is able to hold in the tension and not give herself release, right? She's denying it. And she's constantly sort of saying, like, the men are always finishing their projects, getting the handshakes, fixing their relationship. This is all sort of bringing to the place of release of the buildup, or not wanting to hold the tension, because what does a female do? Hold life, hold the child, and they're able to hold it in while the male is not. There's also a bunch of other little notes. Why is it that when Emily Blunt seems to be a terrible mother, there's also a quick scene of a child that's red, seemingly choking and unable to eat, and we're like, Emily Blunt, you're a dick, you're a horrible mother. But then we have Oppenheimer here, where we're like, oh, maybe it's not his fault, maybe he is okay. Where the male's sort of product, their offspring and creation, it's easier for them to separate with. Whereas with the female, it is not so easy, because, like, what do they do? They hand off the child to the friend, right? What does Oppenheimer do? He hands off the bomb to the military, right? When the mother does it, it seems more terrible. When the man does it, it seems like it's not so bad. So what's the difference going on there? The woman seems to know better the consequences of release, the consequences of your creative act and how it changes the world, right? They know that they cannot escape it, or that they will forever be seen in light of it. But the male seems to have more ways to avoid that responsibility, or to get out of that different criticism. Because the key thing that Oppenheimer does is, in order for us to have sympathy for Prometheus, Prometheus has to be tortured. If Prometheus is not tortured and he gives man fire, then it's easier to blame him for giving man fire and all the destruction that comes from that. So what you have in this movie is the suggestion that Oppenheimer darn well knows that he needs to somehow be tortured by what he has created, so that then there's the possibility of having the fame for creating the bomb, but not the responsibility for the creation, to create a sort of mechanism of using the real of all of the difficulty that he has encountered to separate himself from the creation of something that could lead to the creation of Dall-E, which is not available to the woman. It is not available to Emily Blunt in the same way, but with the male it can be. And it's also very interesting when he meets with Truman. And Truman makes this key line where he's like, you just built the bomb, I dropped it. So there's a mechanism there where if an Oppenheimer is seen, that he cannot be seen so much as a scapegoat for himself of creating the bomb, because now Truman has taken responsibility for dropping the bomb, right? So he needs to somehow create a situation where he is turned on, and by becoming a communist or speaking out against the bomb, then the military turns on him, all of these different friends, all of these different people, then makes him look like a tortured soul that can help create distance between him and the Dall-E that he has potentially brought onto the world. So you see all of these characters, and then also too, and then I'll pass it on because I just thought the movie was infinitely brilliant. You also see where they keep saying this is not a trial, this is not a trial, when he's doing the interview or whatever. Yeah, because it's a psychoanalytical session. He's talking a lot, and it's not until the end that he slips up and you see the truth starting to break through. It's like, you didn't have any moral qualms about, picking the place where the freaking bomb was going to drop, and then later on you did. Oh, blah, blah, blah. Boom. Then all the lights turn white as if the bomb has been dropped, and an interrogation lamp has gone on. And what you see there is then the arrangement of the American Prometheus to be tortured precisely so that he can be remembered better by history, in the same way that Emily Blunt then at the table, she turns around and she says, do you think you'll be forgiven if you let them tar and feather you? Remember, she says that line, and he goes, maybe. Maybe I will. And so what you see here is a designing of creating the sort of the real coming after you, having all of this horrible thing sort of happen to you, but that precisely then creating a way to distance this invention that may give rise to the explosion of the dusting. So anyway, you see female characters that are more aware of the consequences of bringing something to finality in the sexual act. You get a child and they're not so able to distance from it, where you have men that are not able to resist the release that then causes a chain reactions of things that they can't get done with. You also have examples of desire, all these characters wanting to get the commerce, wanting to get to be famous, to be remembered for something, but that's simultaneously also setting things in motion that then they do not want, or that, and you have, of course, in the background a lot of quantum and paradoxical logic that's in operation. So anyway, I think the movie's playing a lot on sex. I'll be quiet now. Also, the Trinity, I love that on the play of the Hindu Trinity on Vishnu, Brahman, and Shiva, destroyer, creator, sustainer, where what you have is the mayor. Once you create a world where nukes exist, you have destroyed a world where the atom bomb doesn't exist. And now the question is, can you sustain the world without it blowing itself up where the atom bomb exists, right? Like that's the dot. You can never go back. You've locked the door behind you. Now you're stuck with this. And how do you sustain it? So I think it's playing so much on sex, death, and these different sort of complicated navigations that Oppenheimer is engaged with to avoid taking responsibility for unleashing dusting. Oh yeah, definitely, like the nuke going off to me was an orgasmic scene, and I'm the destroyer of worlds. And you see like Emily Blunt hold like, no, we're not going to shake hands because that's going to release and that's going to forgive. And there's like the woman holding, but the male can't. They have to.
I thought that was a particularly powerful scene.
Yes. Oh no, and I just thought it was so interesting how the other thing is the movie is a meta-analysis of the movie itself. Like, how will history remember me? How he's positioning himself to be remembered. And then there's a question of, is the movie itself part of the problem in being about Oppenheimer that then kind of makes him famous for creating this bomb, which then means you should create bombs like this because you'll be famous. So there's this question, there's a meta question of the movie itself on itself that I find very interesting.
You know, there's also something that when they're debating about the bomb and Japan, and they're like, well, what if it's already secured, right? What if that loss is already secured, that we don't need to drop the bomb? And this is where I start thinking about the mode of waiting, and how the mode of waiting basically can help you encounter the real, but you don't want to encounter the real. So that's why you're like, let's not try to figure out if we will guarantee some win or not. Let's just secure this right now in the bag, drop the bomb. We don't need to have any more questions about whether we can secure the war or not. And so this is where I feel like what's interesting about waiting, and this is obviously is in close relation to sex, is that waiting, given a certain length of time, makes you ask more questions that make you feel more uncomfortable than you are willing to bear, right? And you see them throughout the entire time when they're trying to make the bomb. They're like, but the Nazis are going to beat us to it, right? The Nazis already know, and right. So there's this sort of impatient, like, we have to do something now. And then there still seems to be this sort of post after the war where it's like, so we're done, right? The women are like you said, Daniel, the women are like, yeah, we're done. And they're like, no. There's still things happening. There's still things that we have to respond to make sure that we've secured everything. And so everything seems to be against waiting, right? Nothing can wait. That's like the whole crazy thing. It's like when you're watching the movie, it's everything is nothing can wait. You have to do something now, right now. And the more that you wait, the more uncertain it really becomes. And so to deter that uncertainty, you're like, all right, let's just make the bomb, drop it. The hydrogen bomb takes too much time. Let's do with the atom bomb, and all this. So I'm curious about waiting in relation to the real and how this sort of rises up in Oppenheimer. And then there's that scene in Emily Blunt where Oppenheimer is crying about the other female that died. And she looks at him and she goes, you like, this is the first time she goes, you did this. Like, you literally did this to yourself. Like, pull yourself together, basically. And you can tell, like, Oppenheimer still doesn't really accept it ever. And it still haunts him. But yeah, I'm gonna leave it there.
No, I think, something else that comes to mind is where someone else pushes the bomb, the button when it goes off, the military takes the bomb, but Emily Blunt goes to the child, right? And there's also, like, we see, even when she's like drinking and doesn't want to go to the child, she eventually does, right? Like, there's this sort of distance where the male, it seems easier to distance yourself from the things you create. And the male is also the one who is more prone to say, like, we have to finish the experiment. Theory will only get you so far. Right? That's also a key line. Theory will only get you so far. But once you get to where theory brings you, you can't go back. Now you're stuck here. So it's like, we can't just live in theory. We have to make it go. Oh, frick. The bomb has gone off. I mean, there are other things as well where there's a kind of like, if indeed Oppenheimer is portrayed in the movie as basically arranging his own martyrdom, there then becomes a enjoyment, kind of a masochism in that very enjoyment, where you're then being like, oh, I am being seen as the martyr, and you can enjoy being the Christ figure, right? So you just move the enjoyment when you go, oh, crap, look what I've done. Well, let me move it. And then you can also have a projection of imagining history seeing you in a positive light and having an enjoyment in that as well. The other thing that comes to mind is one of the genius moves of the movie is that you really never see the Nazis and the Japanese. You never see the Nazis and you never see the Japanese. There is no big other. That's a justification of the project and the desire, but they're never there. And historically, of course, the Manhattan Project is racing the Nazis, and there is a real tension of how many Americans would die when they go into Japan, and that's debated to this day, et cetera, so forth. But in the movie, as a, dare I say, Lacanian analysis, the Germans and the Nazis are never there. We never see the war. We see like a scene of the rock, but you never see any fighting. So you simply see the scientists making decision within their own enclosure about what they want and what they desire and what they think is legitimate. And under those terms, you see well, we have to bring this thing to completion. It's like, well, we have to end the war. Like, yes, you can say, well, it's to end the war. But in the movie, it's basically, how terrible of a movie would it have been if they literally stopped the Manhattan Project? Like, you as a viewer would have been pissed off. Like, let's say in it, they were just like, okay, you're right, and everyone goes home. You would be like, this movie sucks. Well, likewise, they didn't want to just drop the experiment. They're like, no, we have to finish it. But this is where the female characters are so interesting, because again, it's a female who's willing to. Yes, sir.
I have just a quick question.
Please.
What do you make of my impression and Audrey's impression of the movie was that from the start of the movie to the bomb going off, there was a very slow buildup. And then once the bomb's gone off, in terms of social drama, and then once the bomb's gone off, it was like an insane ejaculation. Like, things were going so quickly. What do you make of that?
I think that's exactly right. Because I think that was like pacing wise, very because then it gets a life of its own. Like, once it's gone off, then it's no longer in control. And again, it's like a child. When you birth a child, then the child has a life of their own, and you don't know what it's going to do. And it's just very interesting how it seems more difficult for the mother to distance themselves from what the child does. Where with Oppenheimer, you see strategies of creating distance between how the bomb is used, what the military does, and his responsibility for it. So I really do feel like the movie very subtly and brilliantly makes a kind of a feminist critique, but it's not an overt, unjustified feminist critique. That's part of the brilliance of it, is that it works with the theme of the movie, and it's in the background to not get in the way of the movie, but it's powerfully suggested. It's just completely brilliant. And then there is indeed a speeding up, and then the great climax where, again, the scene where he's sitting there and they're interrogating about moral qualms. Where do those moral qualms come from? The background is shaking just a little bit, like there's been an explosion, like a nuke has gone off. And then there's the bright light, like an interrogation light that's also a nuclear light. And it's interesting because the blurring of an interrogation light and a nuclear light is almost like the Das Ding. You are now confronted with the Das Ding. You are being questioned by the thing that you are trying to avoid has now come forth, and you must respond to it. How do you respond to it? And he doesn't really respond to it. It's a failure of speech, just like Lacan tells you. It's where the speech kind of fails that then the truth comes out. And then Nolan Nolan's like, okay, how do you as a viewer interpret that failure? What's going on? What is he trying to do? And then you start going, oh, he really is potentially trying to navigate himself as a martyr, because a Prometheus that is not a martyr, that isn't eaten by the buzzards for the rest of his life, is one we do not sympathize with. So I think that overlay is just very, very well put, because it definitely seems like the movie and its pacing has us speeding up. And then it's kind of this revelation of the potential that Oppenheimer is using. Mr. Eber, good to see you, sir. We're actually talking about the movie Oppenheimer for a minute, because we're talking about how he seems to use the real to avoid the dusting.
Oh, great,
and how
great to see you, Eber.
It's good to see you, Mr. Eber. And how the whole movie seems to be about sex, in my opinion. Like the entire, so if you haven't seen it, we might be ruining it, but we just had a wonderful seminar with Mr. Boothby, who was talking about the dusting. So again, and I just very taken with the entire conversation, was like, it's not a trial. It's not a trial. Well, no, it's more like a psychoanalytical examination of him to see where the speech fails. And it's where that speech fails that then can be kind of a breaking through of the actuality. But no, I think your point there of the speeding up of the movie is very well put, Cadell.
Did you notice also that his one, I guess his hookup partner was a psychoanalyst and a communist? I thought that was hilarious.
Daniel, how are we thinking about the guy that tries to go after Oppenheimer? How are we thinking him in relation to the whole thing? Because I do find it interesting that towards the end of the movie, he's sort of, he's obsessing over what Einstein said, right? What was possibly said between Oppenheimer and Einstein, right? And then the guy, I guess the aide, he's like, you don't even know like what they actually said. You just assumed that it was said about you. So I'm curious about what's the role or what's the role of this character into everything in relation that we're talking about. Does Oppenheimer, is this part of like Oppenheimer's sort of like self-martyr process that he sort of thwarts to this guy? Because Emily Blunt does point this out. She goes, we all know it's him. We all know he did it. But Oppenheimer wants to do this sort of self-sacrificing moment with everyone. So I'm curious about how we think about that relation and that character.
I think that's an excellent question. So there's a few. One, I think it goes to show you sort of the motivation of desire that's going on, the objective desire versus becoming this very thing that is in a kind of masochistic way, keeping yourself from having the object and actually thus having it because you know you can't occur it. So there's some contrast there. But the key that I think that character also unveils, they say over and over again, well, they say a few times, I gave him Trinity and then tried to separate him from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Shouldn't that have made him happy? And the character said, well, he's not thankful, right? He kind of comes back from that. So there's something very interesting there. Because the question becomes, why did that not satisfy Oppenheimer to be seen as sort of responsible for the Trinity, but not the other two? It's as if there's a sense, and this is just a theory I have, like in the character also is necessary for creating those conditions, and also someone that whom Oppenheimer then separates him from precisely almost because Oppenheimer knows that then this character will come after him, thus making him a martyr as he needs to be, so that history remembers him well. But there's also an idea that it's almost as if Oppenheimer is seen as responsible for Trinity, then everyone's going to praise him while he's alive. Everyone's going to be like, you're a great success and whatever. And there's not going to be any sort of witch hunt, which actually then lowers the possibility that he's remembered well in history because he got it good while he was alive. So historically, it'd be like, well, that a-hole who did Trinity, there wouldn't have been a Hiroshima and a Nagasaki had there not been a Trinity, right? But by actually being blamed, like by not getting that clean separation and then wanting to disown the entire thing, that increases the likelihood that he is then martyred, therefore becomes a Prometheus that doesn't just give man fire, but gives man fire and then has the buzzard eats out his life, like eat it. So he's a tortured Prometheus. Therefore, he has a better chance of being remembered in a good light. He needs that character to engage in the witch hunt. Also, the whole idea of like, it goes to show you was like that you don't even know what Einstein said, right? Well, it's funny right there because it goes to show you how much we imagine what another person is doing when they might be saying something entirely different. And I thought that was actually one of the most brilliant ideas of the entire movie, is that this whole guy's, he's like, oh my gosh, they said these things about me, when really they're talking about maybe that chain reaction did happen, maybe, or different things. And it also just goes to show you how we tend to feed things into our understanding of situations, ultimately in a manner that sort of justifies the way our ego develops, right? So let me put it this way. It is necessary for him to misunderstand that interaction so he can rationalize what he does to Oppenheimer. If he does not have that misunderstanding, then he has much less ammunition and kind of ethical rationalization for going after Oppenheimer, other than he would just have to go, I'm vindictive, with the whole isotope thing, right? Well, that really clearly makes him a dick if he's just vindictive. But if he can say, no, Oppenheimer turned Einstein on me, well, then he has a little more justification for what he does in interpreting the situation that way. So everything that he's doing is in service of his own desire to have status and to be remembered. Well, that means he's actually very similar to Oppenheimer. If Oppenheimer is doing all of this sort of being seen as a martyr for the sake of his historic legacy and the legacy of his children and getting the release that he wanted and not holding it in like Emily Blunt in creating that, then he's actually very, very similar to Strauss. And they actually are mirroring one another. They fight because there is that kind of similarity that is going on. So those are ways that I saw the character.
It's a very well-developed theory, Daniel.
Well, thank you, Cadell. I appreciate it. So yeah, it's the first movie I've seen like literally in 6 years. But no, I really like it.
Oh, for real?
Yeah, I haven't been to a theater in 6 years, so I'm such a simpleton. But Christopher Nolan, I go to see because I really, really like him. I felt like Oppenheimer also was I felt like it really grounded his movie and his deep thinking in a particular personal life, so it was more thematically coherent. And again, the command sentence of the theme is the notion of do not let your desire for release result in a chain reaction that you will not
really
want
like
to own.
that.
Because he has to have the release. They have to finish the project. And it's okay, well, you finished the project. Here we are now. And everything sort of speaks to that. And with the tower being the phallic symbol, the bomb going off, there was some other things that escaped. I also do appreciate, like, if indeed, I think it also speaks like this idea that creation destroys, destruction creates, all these things speaks to the quantum logic, the paradox that's kind of in the background of the whole thing, right? Like the kind of way that humans have paradoxical motivations is thematically matched with what does Oppenheimer do? He brings quantum mechanics to America, they keep saying, right? He's bringing this kind of paradoxical logic following Bohr as he was speaking, right? Well, yeah, he's also...
They literally said that too.
Yeah, he's bringing this kind of like backwardsness, this kind of upside downness. Well, likewise, he's bringing sort of this kind of character that would engage paradoxically with creating something they then want to disown, remembered by fame, but not being responsible for. There's a paradoxical logic operating in the character of Oppenheimer that thematically matches with the quantum mechanics that he brings to America. But what were you trying to say, sir? I'm sorry.
Didn't they have Oppenheimer as a character, whether this is historically true or not? Also link this paradoxical logic to both Freudian and Marxist theory.
I do know, like, his first wife, like you said, was a psychoanalyst. He talked about the Marx. They talked about how he's like, oh, I read the first three. Oh, I'm sorry, I read it in German. So it's like property is there. It's like ownership is that. There is absolutely in the entire movie a sort of speaking of a kind of paradoxical logic and operation. And you could say the entire Red Scare is paradoxical. We're a free nation as long as you're not a communist.
Yeah, the psychological and the political dynamics were fascinating throughout the entire. I mean, absolutely fascinating.
Well, and the movie does suggest, again, if Oppenheimer is using kind of the real, the thwarting of desire, the plating of himself as the martyr, like turning people against him to avoid responsibility for creating an invention that could lead to the Das Ding, then you see a maneuvering that is using these categories in Lacan. Like it's clear that the real doesn't have to entail the Das Ding, but that the Das Ding can entail the real. You see in the character of Oppenheimer ways of maneuvering these things to actually create distance between them. Now, of course, we could argue that it's not really the real, because if he desires to be martyred, then it's not the thwarting of desire to have his like legacy getting all tarnished in different things. But the appearance, let's put it this way, there's a way to perform as if you are having the real be confronted you, that everyone thinks the real is confronting you, that then helps you be the martyr that you need to be in order to not be seen by history as a monster. So you can kind of use the real performatively, but it's not actually the real, precisely to sort of get what you want, which is to kind of distance yourself. It's also potentially another thing that could be going on there is if he feels guilt. It's clear that he feels some kind of guilt for creating the bomb, because he has that scene in the theater, you know, where they're stomping and then he sees the body and he has this kind of guilt. So there's also this notion of the potential of Oppenheimer looking to kind of transmute that guilt into a feeling of martyrdom. Like, you feel this guilt. Well, what if actually, no, it's the feeling of being a martyr? Because another theme of that movie that was so important, they kept saying, do you even know what you believe? Like, Oppenheimer seems to have the ability to self-deceive himself in incredibly profound ways, right? And that's something they keep saying. So it is very possible that he himself was able to believe that he wasn't martyring himself, that he actually was a martyr, and thus genuinely create that separation between what he did and you know, what he has created and what he's done. So he himself seems to be a self-deception machine, which would then speak that the very power of intelligence could be the power to engage in self-deception, right? In the same way that, like, just in that little allusion to Kurt Gödel, he's like, oh, he thinks all the food is, like, you know, all the food is poison, right? There's this suggestion that brilliant people can do crazy things, right? All throughout. Well, what if he's able to just use his intelligence to self-deceive himself into truly believing he's a martyr, so that he himself takes less responsibility and for what he's done, and he doesn't feel the guilt so harshly. So that's another thing, the power of his. He apparently has radical self-deception power, as everyone does.
I thought that relationship with the in regards to self-deception and the belief, I suppose, is that one wasn't it the physicist who ended up creating or proposing the hydrogen bomb?
Yes.
That relationship, I think, displayed this tension well of self-deception belief. He was constantly concerned. What do you believe? You don't believe. What, you know? I think he said something like, "What do you really believe?" or something like that.
Oh yeah, and it also is interesting because it seems easier to engage in self-deception when you have the division between theory. Like, they're always like, theory can only get you so far, right? As if they want to experiment. But when you're in the realm of theory, it's easier to self-deceive. Once it's actualized, self-deception becomes more difficult.
Yeah, you've got to combine theory and experiment. But I'm wondering, has Ebert seen this movie?
Ebert, we're ruining all of Oppenheimer for you if you haven't seen it. Oh, we've ruined it. Oh gosh. It's well, actually,
I haven't seen it.
Dang it! I'm sorry.
It's okay though.
Okay, good man.
No, I don't. It's all good. I don't mind.
Good man. Good man. Yeah,
I'm
it's
enjoying the conversation about it. I mean, it's a universal conversation. I can understand the general conversation because it's generalizable.
What about this? Oppenheimer as what we're doing? Oppenheimer as a split subject for the splitting of the atom, right?
Oh, I like. There was some. Dang, what was I writing? Because there is something too where it's like what is the atom bomb but a splitting? It's kind of this splitting of reality, right? Like, you're splitting the atom. Likewise, it's the splitting of the person of Oppenheimer, and you have to get to. And that's why I think when he's in the interrogation scene, that the bomb goes off right when speech fails, right? Like, oh, that's where we split the subject. The subject is now unveiled to be split, right? Likewise, the bomb goes over and there's a split there. So I think it's absolutely playing on that. And is what's necessary for the human being actually to develop that ability to not have to see everything through to the end, like to have the ability to actually know when you need to stop something, because if you keep going, it might actually, you know, lead to something like the breaking through of the dusting, right? Like, do you want to do that? Like, if you get to a certain level of excess, if you will, maybe to allude to freak theory from Mr. Ebert, like there's actually a point where that's then going to be a kind of shift. You're going to have a new world, but this is the world that now has the atom bomb. But then again, you can read Homo Deus, and he's kind of like, dude, the atom bomb's great because that's what stopped war, right? The Eunoia guy, and he even says that in the movie. He's like, yeah, okay, I know Hitler's dead, but
this was what interests me. The end of the basic the distinction between him thinking the atomic bomb might be the perpetual peace versus setting off a chain reaction which is just out of control.
Yep.
And I think he's concluding the latter.
Yep.
No?
Oh,
and I think that's a really interesting perspective, I think, for our moment, because we feel so distant from that reality.
yes.
We feel so distant from the Cold War. We're not Cold War babies. We're you know. So I think this is a very interesting thing to leave with so many people, the public consciousness. Very powerfully. I think it's a very powerful movie.
Well, this is to me the interesting question. Would there have been a way to avoid the invention of the atom bomb?
Like, will we see a bomb of that magnitude dropped on a city in the 21st century?
Sure.
Will that happen? What are the probabilities of that happening? And that they show you. Look, I compared the bombs of Nagasaki or Hiroshima
and Nagasaki, yeah,
to the possibility of the bombs we could create. Like, we could create way bigger bombs.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, there's an argument to be made that I've heard people say that the further away the atomic bomb becomes a memory, the more likely people are to use it, because it becomes more abstract and theoretical again, right? Exactly. It's not a practical reality, right? And I've heard some people say
it loses its concreteness.
It loses its concreteness, and so then it's a toy. And the problem is once the DOS thing breaks through, it can't unbreak through, right? Like, that's why it's very interesting to tie to Blown Away by Dr. Boopy. Like, unfortunately, once his son committed suicide, as he wrote about so powerfully in his book, you can't go to a world where your son has not committed suicide. You are locked in that world forever. Likewise, once the bomb goes off at Trinity, like, it's so interesting because the moment the bomb goes off at Trinity, it's almost like it's over. Now the military's taking it. It's like immediately taken from Oppenheimer, right? It's done. And that's interesting because it's like, once you make that choice to see where all your experimenting and theorizing is leading, it's over.
Your point, Daniel, with the man and the woman in the distance. As soon as the bomb goes off, it's taken away. That's like the pregnancy.
Yes.
And it's taken away from him. So he's got a distance.
Yep.
Whereas that doesn't happen to a woman and her baby. Well, that,
Right. Oh, and the movie is suggesting that the entire time. And in fact, when the military takes the bomb away, there's a kind of almost sympathy for Oppenheimer. But when they give the baby away, there's a kind of like, you monster, and it's just very interesting, that kind of double standard that is being suggested. But Javier, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's this moment where the wisdom actually gets passed down to Oppenheimer. And it's between Einstein and him. And Einstein looks at him, and correct me if I'm wrong, I want to say he looks at him and goes, "It's your world now." Right? Like, he's like, what I did, that was my world. What you did, it's just not a new discovery. It's a whole new world that you just did. Right? And what I think what we're pressing on here is that it's so easy to forget this new world. We don't have somebody to pass along like Einstein and be like, hey, what I did, is what I did. This is the world I created. But now you're about to create this whole new world. And with Isabel Millar's kind of work, and I liked her whole piece on the Patty Political, when she talks about Badiou's, she quotes Badiou in saying, speed hides inconsistency, right? And this is where I'm like, this is where it's so threatening when we start talking about nuclear bombs and everything, is that because speed seems to be the primary movement of technology and the way we understand information, everything, it seems like the spatial temporal context from which we derive this wisdom from, it evaporates just as fast as it arrives, basically, and so I do see the threat that you and Cadell are basically pointing out, that it's not, I mean, we're in some sense aware of like the dangers of the bomb, but it's like we could easily just as forget how horrible it was, because we're not, the context is just it's so distant from us. And it's crazy how the context can be so distant from us in just a matter of 10 years, in a matter of 20 years. The speed is not following linear time.
It absolutely blows my mind that World War II is real. Like, how the hell was World War II real? Like that was like less than 100 years ago. You're telling me that it's unthinkable.
Well, I will say I was extremely lucky simply to be able to sit on the porch every afternoon and listen. My grandfather served on the Iowa, and just hearing, he was drafted like at 17, right? Or 8, very young, and to hear those different stories. And it is, if you're like, is this real? Did this occur? Can humans do this? But that kind of speaks to a kind of Lacan where, to me, I guess World War II is almost Das Ding more than the real. Like, it's this unknown. You kind of know about it, but it's also this thing that can kind of break through at any moment where there's almost like a luxury. And I'll have to think how I word that. I'm not sure about that. But like, if the real is I paid for my electricity and the bill didn't arrive and now I have to pay an extra $100, like your desire is thwarted kind of real, that's almost like only a problem because World War III is not breaking through as the kind of Das Ding, right? And that's kind of like where it's almost like what Oppenheimer is doing is positioning the real as a problem for him to avoid owning the possibility of the breakthrough of Das Ding that he has now made.
It seems like Das Ding has enormous consequences for politics.
I think so.
Enormous.
Oh, I think so. Well, so there's a few things. What does it mean to create politics aware of an unknown that you then get the public to care about? Like I was listening to the guy that Tim interviewed, the environment. I can't remember his name, but he had a fascinating. He was talking about like weather models, and he was talking about global warming and different things. He was just making the point of how difficult it is to get people to care about something like global warming because it's about it, but honestly, it's an unknown. It's nothing more than a phrase, really, until you lose your crop, right? But then the point is that he was just making is like once the environmental problems become real, it's like too late, right? Like it's like the same people are saying with the population problem, the depopulation. Once you kind of realize it, well, then it's too kind of far gone in different things. And it's like, what does it mean? I think the challenge is the following: if we take Sleyberg, different people talk about the meta crisis, these complicated crises upon crises that require a politics to prepare people for things that they really can't even think about, then basically we're talking about how do you have politics where that helps people think about things that they don't have the conceptual apparatus to think about. That seems to be the challenge now because you're facing all of these problems that require a certain conceptual apparatus to get that. Even if you get it, you don't even fully get it because still it's in theory versus practice, let alone if you don't even have that. So what would it mean to have a kind of politics of the Das Ding? Maybe that's the language. I associate that with what Dr. Millar was saying with the patty politics. Like if that, maybe that's the event as well. I can't help but see the event as the thing that once it occurs, the door is locked behind you and you can't go back. Like once the nuke is invented, you can't go back.
Let me just tell a little story. I don't know if it's going to overlap perfectly, but hopefully it overlaps, points to what you're talking about. It's a weird experience I had when I was at home when COVID-19 broke out. Was that my mom, so I had just gotten my doctorate. My mom had the reaction like, you have a doctorate, can't you do something? Like, like, can you help with COVID? Like you, it's like, no, like I'm just as impotent as you are. It's like, I can do absolutely nothing. Right. But like in her, all I had that she didn't have was a kind of conceptual apparatus that allowed me to, I think, sense make, maybe is the right word, the event of COVID. But I think patty politics that's the initiation into patty politics, is when you realize, I think, that your conceptual framework is completely impotent to the whatever the fuck is happening.
It brings to mind a question to throw it on the table. So there's this kind of situation. Should the Manhattan Project not have occurred? Should the nuclear bomb not have been invented, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Could philosophy have stopped the Cold War if it had been positioned to have power? Does philosophy have the resources to stop something like the Manhattan Project? Obviously, Hegel's like, no, you kind of interpret, right? But if not, then the question becomes, what is the role of philosophy in a patty politics? What is the role of philosophy in a politics of the Das Ding? Which is, to me, what kind of the Oppenheimer sort of opens up. It seems like movie makes it kind of clear that science wasn't able to do much. Science was just having to kind of be led along by the experimentation and the game theory dynamics. Could philosophy have made a difference? If not, what is the role of philosophy in a Das Ding politics or a patty politics? Is it impetus? Why is it there? What is it? What value add does it have? And I saw you unmute, Cadell. I'll give it to you, and then I'll give it to Javier.
Oh, well, I don't know. I mean, it's a really interesting question. My first response would be to just look at like, well, I'm just going to speak from my own position. Like, I don't think philosophy portal can't stop something like coronavirus. Philosophy portal is a response to coronavirus. I think philosophy is a response to tragedies and catastrophes, but I don't think it can prevent tragedies and catastrophes. I think maybe that's why psychoanalysis is so much coming into the philosophical picture.
Ooh. That's interesting. I mean, I associate, and I'll give it to Javier. Like, for me, there's the association of philosophy with self-defense from David Hume. Like, you are engaged in self-defense, you're defending yourself, you're trying to avoid capture, you're trying to understand. So there's a kind of self-defense, but the question of, that's very interesting.
Reconciliation.
Yes, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And the mediation of difference, that all seems quite important, but it's interesting to think of, is philosophy merely preventative? Now, of course, if you can't defend yourself, then you also can't engage in an offense because you're being overwhelmed with bad ideas or controlled. So this doesn't mean philosophy doesn't have a role, but it's interesting to think, is it more preventative? But let me give it to Javier. Javier.
Yeah, I'm really liking Cadell's anecdote on this because it actually reminds me of this big kind of argument I had with my friend, and he's like, man, but you could change the world, if you just be more systematic, and I'm like, no, I don't believe that shit at all. And this was like the sort of position that we kept fighting over, and I was like, I don't know how to explain this, but to get to this question of the apparatus you're talking about, Daniel, and philosophy. So I grew up in a kind of matriarchy, ironically, and it's funny because the most useful thing that my grandma did that they all loved, that is sort of unexplainable, is that she would just always pray. She would just, like, my grandmother had no knowledge of sort of like rebutting or comforting you intellectually. It was just like she would just grab your hand and she'd be like, let's pray, right? So what's the point that I'm getting at with this is that philosophy also has this kind of impotent quality to it that I think ritual also has the same impotent quality as a technology to sort of navigate the masses, basically, right? It's hard to convince somebody about the impotence intellectually. And I think we've even gone to the point where it's even more ridiculous to tell somebody, hey, just pray. You know what I mean? Like, it sounds so ridiculous to even ask someone to do that, right? Because we're so anxious to respond and do something about it. That I do think some type of ritualization or bringing back ritual in the more broader context can sort of give this mimic of what philosophy does in terms of its impotent apparatus. Because I don't see how philosophy could convince the masses, really. But I do think that they could connect to it on a physical level of this motion of impotence. Because things like ritual and praying, they do seem rather impotent. The only danger with this technology is the fact that people think it's not impotent. Right? That's the other side of the card, that people don't think it's impotent. So there's always a challenge with that, but I do think I think we can get at a kind of framework that kind of helps navigate that, because I mean, again, I do find philosophy useful in understanding the impotence of it all, but it's much more difficult to convince somebody about the impotence sort of intellectually, and kind of point to it, right? But I think bringing back ritual in this sphere can be helpful to navigate more kind of things that we can't cognize emotionally for the, you could say, the masses.
No, I appreciate the comment. I'll give it to Cadell. You know, as we're speaking, so now I'm thinking about weak theology, but Caputo that you're speaking about. And then, of course, there's the example of, well, obviously Marxism changed the world. Obviously, philosophy of the Scottish Enlightenment changed the world. So there's this weird thing. Does philosophy change the world when it becomes an ideology? And then if it becomes an ideology, it's problematic. So does philosophy to be good have to be weak? Because if it becomes an ideology, it can change the world. Christianity changed the world, right? You know, prayer and different things. It shifted Islam, all of these things. So there's this weird thing where ideas seem to have made the world, and then they simultaneously seem incapable of changing anything. So there's this weird double move going on that's hard to put one's finger on. But let me give it to Cadell last.
Well, I just wanted to say on the Marx point quickly of, you know, changing the world. I mean, I think that's like always the reference thing with Marx and Hegel, right? Is like Marx turned Hegel on his head. Hegel could only think the world, but he couldn't change the world. And they said always, this is always even said about Marx and the whole of philosophy period, that philosophy is hitherto only thought, but now we have to change the world. So the question of, is Marx a philosophy like a traditional philosophy in that sense, but in regards to like this more philosophy of having this impotent quality, of course, I don't think Marx would share that thesis, but simply, but what more to what Javier was saying, I think I said this actually on Philosophy of Black one day, is that my approach differentiates from the proselytizing approach of philosophy. Like, I don't think you can proselytize it. So like, just in regards to what Javier was saying about we cannot convince the masses, I don't think we should want to convince anyone. But connecting on a physical level, and to me, more the feminine approach, which is to wait, I guess, and to let come, and to create, and I think to more create those spaces where magic can happen, maybe. And I just want to think, like, again, with what philosophy, like, say, okay, so I teach courses. It has its limit, right? Like philosophy, at the same time, I think philosophy lectures, philosophy courses have, I think, an integral part of building a culture. Like Theory Underground, I think that work is important and stuff. But to me, it always points to the idea of the retreat. The retreat, the gathering, the space where some magic can happen, and we can think very. To me, this is where philosophy becomes like more like I think of like the types of Greek symposium. You know, we have a nice dinner, we're drinking, or whatever, you know, like whatever, like just, it's a nice environment. We have good food, we have good environment, we have good surroundings, view, scenery. And to me, this is where a new culture could really consolidate itself.
That was very well put. So a few things come to mind. I always am interested in this distinction between problem solving and problem prevention. And the issue is that if you problem prevent, you never see the problem that you prevented, so it can look like you didn't do anything. Where if you problem solve, then it can look like you're really active in accomplishing something because you're solving a problem, but that problem only exists because you didn't do something to prevent it from coming into existence, right? So there can almost be a bias toward enterprises that problem solve over problem prevent. So for example, once you don't exercise and you have a bad heart, then you get the problem of heart attacks. Then the way you problem solve is maybe taking the heart attack medication. You say, oh man, you're doing what you're supposed to do. You're taking your medication. But what you are supposed to do is entirely framed by failing to problem prevent having the bad heart, right? And so I wonder sometimes if maybe philosophy has a lot to do with problem prevention. And once a problem emerges, it's kind of too late. Now it goes in the realm of science. Now it goes in the realm of politics. And then, this is like philosophy didn't do a job, right? So the question then becomes, what is philosophy's job? If we take, so there's a few stabs at it. One, if we take, I've been going through Joseph Piper's book on leisure, which I know at the Stoa they talk about, Peter, and there's this kind of idea that leisure is not idleness, but the ability to have nothing happen, but be the fullness of the human being coming out, right? Like the retreat, right? And it's kind of, leisure is not idleness, but the ability to say, enjoy an empty room by yourself, or you can enjoy being alone, or you can see beauty, etc., so forth, right? Like if, let's say philosophy is in the business of training people to be able to enjoy leisure, well, if so, then they might be able to be satisfied without having the sexual release of a bomb going off, like an Oppenheimer or something, right? So then leisure problem prevents, but guess what? The only way to maintain that space of problem prevention is to look like you're doing nothing and you're wasting your life and you're not being productive. So then there's status anxiety. So then people go back into the realm where everyone can see them solving problems. But once you're in the realm of solving problems, then you're in the realm of not preventing the Manhattan Project, but you're in the Manhattan Project, and it's almost too late at that point because now the game theory dynamics are in operation. So I'll give it to Javier. So I wonder if there's something about problem prevention versus problem solving that's part of this as well.
It it kind of makes me think that Plato is like the expert on Das Ding. Because he seems to do this thing, and I've been rereading the Euthyphro dialogue, where he's, he keeps pointing about piety. And what I've been kind of in my reading of this is that it's fascinating that piety in connection to law seems rather actually very obscure, the way Socrates talks about it. Because he's like, so he basically says, why are we keep going in a circle about piety and the law? And it seems to be like piety already establishes the law in some sense. That we're already pious about something. This is why we're following it. He's like, you can't even determine whether the gods made that rule or you self-constructed the rule. But already the piety sort of comes in. So back to the anecdote with my friend with what you're talking about, Daniel, is that I try to, because he's very much adamant about let's do something, change the world, whatever. I said my problem with this concept is that the proposed problem may not even be the problem. This is what, to me, like what philosophy tends to get at. Whatever problem that we're talking about may not actually be the problem. So if you say it's problem A, I don't think it linearly progresses to problem B. In fact, it just could be that A is not actually the A problem. It's not the problem. And this feels like the Das Ding that philosophy kind of circles around the entire time. It's like, we all say to each other, well, that's the wrong question. That's the wrong problem. That's the wrong way to approach it, right? And it seems annoying, and it seems, and people can feel annoyed by that kind of thing, but it really does show that if you keep questioning the problem, you are in some sense doing problem preventing, because it may not actually be the problem. And so when you decide that this is the problem, and then you decide to solve it, you don't know the consequences that will be unleashed from this problem. Because in fact, it may not even be the problem that you actually unleashed in this case. And so it becomes an unknown chain reaction that in fact that you couldn't even determine the origin of the problem in the first place. And so then we're constantly doing this tracing back, and it's haunting us. It's haunting us constantly about whether this was actually the problem or not. The biggest fear, in my opinion, is the fact that people assume they know what the problem is, and then they try to respond. And this is what honestly scares me the most with anything. It is this kind of innate, I know what the problem is, and I'm going to respond. But we all know, if we take from Heidegger and Plato, that when you ask a question, you already, in some sense, know what you're looking for, right? You know what you're looking for. So let's inverse that. Let's try to hit at questions that we may not know what we're looking for, but we have to ask questions in that case. So it's like these questions can sort of trace around the edges of what we don't know, of what we don't know what we're looking for, even though we have to, in some sense, set a question and give a kind of direction for assuming we know what we're looking for. And yeah, but I'll leave it there.
No, I think honestly, a lot of problem solving reinforces an ideology, because the problem solving occurs within an interpretation of the situation that reinforces the ideology that you never question. So then problem solving has an ideological function, where asking, is this the problem? Well, to ask that, you have to question the framework. Oh gosh, well, now we're questioning the ideological structure. So I think it's good. Let me give it to Cadell and then Mr. Ebert. Cadell.
Just very quickly, and I want this to function as kind of also a fun way to think about the start of the Acree course, which is philosophy and the Manhattan Project. So what would philosophy's role have been with physics in preventing or more intelligently navigating something like what happened with the construction of the atomic bomb? And my reference here is going to be, I just watched a fantastic little video that was, I can find the link, but it was like a podcast basically with Sean Carroll and Slavoj Žižek. Sean Carroll is a top-level physicist or whatever. And of course, Slavoj Žižek's a philosopher. And the interesting thing about the entire conversation is the way Žižek approached Sean Carroll was not in this postmodern distance from physics, like deconstructing physics, being critical of physics. It was more like a detective. He acted like a detective with the physicist, like asking, and like he was like a police officer, like and investigating a crime. and Sean Carroll responded really well to that approach. And they got somewhere, like they invest. So I think this is an interesting, and the reason why that's an interesting way to approach the start of the Acree course is because Lacan opens up with the paper, The Purloined Letter, the stolen letter about the symbolic order. And long story short, there's a fourth position in the story that's important, which is the role of the detective. And how could we be more like a detective in regards to the nature of the symbolic order? So I think this is an interesting way to think maybe about philosophy.
I think that's lovely. I'll give it to Alexander Ebert. I like that with the detective. Mr. Ebert, good to see you, sir.
It's great to see you guys. Yeah, I think that largely the role of philosophy is to problematize the problem solvers and the problem solving. I usually just reject whenever I start to sniff problem solving as philosophy. The problem with that, as a philosopher, of course, I see a problem with that, is that you cannot begin a philosophy with an intention, in my view. That's not philosophy. That's religioneering, that's politics, that's whatever. That's social building. It's not philosophy. You can't begin with an assumption and then produce a sound philosophy. And by assumption, I mean an intentional, like an outcome. This is bad, and so we're going to do this. The is ought problem, and so I think largely our job is to problematize the problem solvers and the problem solving, which of course creates new problems, and some of us peel off of philosophy and like Marx peels off to try and actually you know, okay, I've problematized the process here, and I'm gonna peel off and become a politician, which is effectively is what he was in my view. Like, you know, and yeah. So anyway, there's that. Then there's also this thing about leisure, which I call suboptimal or suboptimization. I think that philosophy, as soon as it leans into optimization, like if you're like, okay, we have this great idea, now let's do it. Well, now let's suddenly optimize the process, and we're going to get rid of the extraneous pieces, and we're no longer going to meander and explore. We're now on an expedition. Well, then that's also no longer philosophy. Now you're on, and that's not bad. You can go in and out of being a philosopher, but it's no longer philosophy, and you're going to create problems that then other philosophers are going to be like, ah. And you know, it's this ecosystem of problem production and problem analysis, which all goes to say that we all love problems, right? And that in a lot of ways, problematizing something is the production of a problem. The problem solvers have produced a problem that they're trying to solve. Every problem solution produces its own myriad problems. And when we think about, well, what can be done? Well, what if, you know, I mean, the real answer, the real actual answer is nothing. If we all just stop doing shit, everything would be fine. But we can't. We must create problems. And if we run out of problems, we'll produce new ones. And that is manifestly apparent
Excess.
with woke or whatever you want to look at, right? So this is the human condition, is to fucking find and or generate problems. And in philosophy, we, instead of being on the very front line of like problem creation, we're more like problem identification. And then people take those identifications and then start running and trying to solve for those identifications vis-a-vis solution. And then we sit back and we're like, that's not quite right. Here's the other problems. And it's just this fucking ongoing problem cycle. But yeah, I do like, I like the suboptimal and what Cadell is referring to in doing retreats. Well, that's not an optimal use of my time. Therefore, it's philosophical. If I'm, you know, Hegel could
But
have said
not these
everything.
retreats, Ebert. Like, you know, the retreats you're making fun of in your brilliant, you know your brilliant app.
Which one? Tuners?
No, the app.
Yeah.
Others.
Yeah.
Was absolutely. We have to. Daniel, did you listen to it? Okay, and Javier, we have to get Javier a coffee. We're not doing retreats like it has to be beyond this
Oh
new
no, I
age
was kidding.
retreat.
Yeah, of course. And it would have to be the most suboptimal. It's going to be amazing. And I guess what I'm saying is, because it's not an optimal use of my time, it is therefore the best use of my time. I'm trying to creativity. If I was to be like, oh, I'm a musician and I optimize my time according to the given song I'm writing, that's not an artist. That's not the optimization has a very clear relationship to homogenization. The fully optimized process is the one that takes no time, no energy. It's literally at homeostasis. So sub-optimization is where philosophy lives and thrives. And that's why it's very often oblique and confusing. It has to be. I mean, it should be. Otherwise, it's not philosophy. You know, if you could say it in 5 words and boil it down to some Hemingway pithy shit, then it's just a meme. And so there's something in the suboptimal which is related to the leisure thing that Daniel was bringing up, and so on and so forth. Cheers. But yeah, I like, you know, I love the idea of the in-person thing and the doing it and now like figuring exploration, you know.
I think it's
The
brilliant.
spirit child.
Spirit child. There you go.
Well, so there's a few things. Like, the moment you start saying we're going to optimize to what? did you pick it? Like, if it just happens to be optimization that everyone else agrees on, or that gets you more money, it's probably optimization relative to an ideology that's not yours, that's actually controlling you. Like, there's the question of optimizing to what. But that, I think what you're getting at about philosophy having this critical role of problematizing the problem solvers cannot be overstated, because it's almost like what we don't understand is that once something gets going, it has a life of its own. So we better frickin' take our time and really problematize these ideas of action. The Manhattan Project is a great idea of this. Like, once the whole movie is about something getting a life of its own, right? Like, action always leads to like chain reactions, right? And so the philosopher is like, precisely, it's this role, this really critical role of problematizing the ideas of the problem solutions from a kind of wisdom, if you grant that phrase, of once something gets going, there's no telling what it will do. And do we really want this to get going? We're so eager to act and to do something with our lives and to get going. How many people, I know so many people that were so eager to start a career and now they hate their career. They were so eager to move and live somewhere, and now that they're there, they're like, I wish I wasn't here. Well, they were real quick. They didn't sit back and say, let me take some time to be suboptimal before I make a choice. It's almost like the philosopher really takes choice seriously. Like, they really take choice seriously, because it's like, you do understand that once you choose to do this, there's no telling. And now there's a kind of like inaction that's fear-based, where you're saying, I'm not acting because I'm afraid of choice. But then there's a form of leisure that actually knows that life is not about making a lot of choices. It's about making a few really quality choices. And being in a place where you sub-optimize so that your thinking is not captured by the optimizing system increases the probability that you're going to make a quality choice that is not simply going to lead into you being captured, right? But that then requires you facing the status anxiety, facing sort of this idea that you're not doing anything with your life, and this fear of not engaging in action, and then other people seeing you not engaging in action. But if you're not willing to do that, well, then your life is basically just going to be pulled along by whatever the notions of optimization are, or the notions of problem solving. And the thing that also should be noted on this idea of, does philosophy change the world? Again, if we look at like a book like To Change the World by James Hunter, or Randall Collins' Theory of Intellectual Change, ideas absolutely shape the framework by which people make choices in. It's just that the philosophy today doesn't tend to be what changes the world. The philosophy today tends to be what's changing the world 10 to 20 years from now, right? So there is a kind of downstream effect that philosophy has. So all the more reason to make sure one does not have a philosophy with an intention that's then going to force the world into those paradigms that then people are going to problem solve according to, and then set something in motion that one day they'll be like, how do we end up here? I wish we wouldn't have. All the more better for the philosopher to be training habits of problematizing problems, which requires a sub-optimization and leisure, so that then when they do choose to do something, the higher the probability that it leads in the direction of quality, not some sort of Manhattan Project that they're like, oh my gosh, how do we end up here, right? And so I think what you're getting at there, Mr. Ebert, and then this notion, yeah, because it's like, there's this obsession now with optimization. Optimization for what? Like, to do what? According to what framework? You're not even asking those questions. Well, then the likelihood of making quality decisions goes down, and instead you get carried on by something. But let me pass it on, whoever would like to speak.
I just wanted to say that this is to me, I think, puts a finger on or a hammer on the nail of a problem that I do think I've encountered with Philosophy Portal, which is not having an intention of forcing a certain type of thought. And where I encounter sort of this tension in the social field is, I think, in between forms of collectivism. Like specifically in the most extreme situation, you could have on the one hand Marxism, and then on the other hand Christianity, where there's forms of collectivism which have obviously I don't know how they have an intention. And so this and more, like I said about Marxism before, to change the world. That's the point of it, to shape the world. And what is the relationship between Marxism and Christianity? To me, this is a mega question. But all I can do is from the philosophical point of view, just say, oh, look at this mega.
Well, I'll pass it to Javier and then Mr. Ebert.
Problem prevention is always at a radical disadvantage to problem solving because it's not able to show the metric. Like, you can't show the problem that didn't manifest. And so how can you prove you added value? But if I solve a problem, so there's like all the metrics, quantification is on the side of problem solving, not problem prevention. And if stuff like philosophy or the humanities is more in the business of creating a certain character who's okay with, say, sub-optimization in favor of quality choices of their own, as opposed that are according to an optimization framework, that's really difficult to quantify. So then how do you convince people to give you money for it? How do you convince to do investment? How do you convince to grow it? This right here kind of speaks to a kind of dynamic that favors problem solving, which then if problem solving that just gets carried away by its ideas of things leads to the apocalypse or the Manhattan Project, we've got an issue because everything favors the problem solving that leads to these Nash equilibrium and horrors. But let me give it to Javier.
Not only is the optimization so ridiculous sometimes, but even the dating discourse is just filled with optimization. It's filled with optimization to like such an extreme level. What is a high value man? This is like the most debatable concept in YouTube, TikTok culture, about what is the high value man, and like the one thing
Fresh and Fit already solved it.
Yeah, absolutely. I love them. But what's so hilarious to me is like it's always a discourse about something that they can never anticipate. What does that mean? It means that the dating discourse can never be about love. It always has to be about some type of optimization, which is such an ironic move because it's like, I'm like, I don't think you guys understand the black hole of love that you guys are talking about, because optimization just goes out the fucking window the moment you're in love. Like, you're just like, I didn't expect to love that person. Now I hate that person. I don't understand why I'm so attracted to that person. Like, just all this nonsensical things that you can't make sense of through optimization. You can't optimize it. It's a fucking black hole. But I want to read this quote from Milan Kundera because I think he hit it on the head, and I want to talk about why speed can't let us feel the weight of things, which is problematic. So here's a quote that he has. Speed is the form of ecstasy the technical revolution has bestowed on the man. As opposed to a motorcyclist, the runner is always present in his body, forever required to think about his blisters, his exhaustion. When he runs, he feels his weight, his age, more conscious than ever of himself and of his time of life. This all changes when man delegates the faculty of speed to a machine. From then on, his own body is outside the process, and he gives order to a speed that is non-corporeal, non-material, pure speed, speed itself, ecstasy speed. I mean, if you want to talk about Oppenheimer, it's about how fast you can fuck, and it seems like optimization is this exact speed, ecstasy, how fast you can fuck, how fast can you read books in a couple of days, how fast can you become a high value man, how fast can you earn money, how fast can you do all this stuff. It's about fast fucking, and nobody knows what's happening after you fuck. So I'll leave it there.
How fast can you meditate?
Right, exactly.
Oh, I meditate. I learned meditation in 1 day, man.
I do my mantra like fucking Om Namah Shivaya. I just repeat that shit so quick. I get that space within 30 seconds. Just quantitative
Yeah.
thresholds, man. Quantitative
I get there
thresholds.
in 30 seconds, man.
The quantitative, you just cram it. I mean, so speed creates compression, and compression creates information loss. So, and then we end up in, we're back to equilibrium. I wouldn't agree maybe that equilibrium is not a spiritual experience. I mean, this is the interesting thing, right? part of the problem with philosophy is not simply that it makes you contemplate choices more. You get really highly exposed to what everyone else perceives as a cognitive dissonance, as a cognitive harmonic. And then all of a sudden, both right and wrong are the right thing. And you can no longer just be like, I'm a man of action, this is the right thing to do. It's like, well, this is also right and wrong. Everything you're doing is right, and at one point it's going to be wrong. You expose yourself to the dialectic, you expose yourself to the sort of Buddhistic form is emptiness, emptiness is form, and all of a sudden taking action in some way that's going to kill a bunch of people, for instance, becomes far more difficult to justify. However, it also, ironically and perfectly, because of everything I just said, becomes perfectly easy to justify. And so you end up in this very difficult position where you suddenly are given far more agency than you ever had before, because no longer are your decisions based on any ethical precondition. All of a sudden, both right and wrong can be made sense of, especially if you get into the dialectic and you understand sublation and all these things, or even if you don't and you're just studying Buddhist shit, or you're studying fucking Hindu and you're whatever, and you're reading the fucking Bhagavad Gita. Like, in fact, isn't that what Oppenheimer quotes at the end of his shit? So it's just like, once you get exposed deeply to philosophy, you no longer have any moral compass. You certainly have no ethical compass. You understand that both right and wrong meet on the dark side of the moon, and so all of a sudden you're left to really be an agential being for the first time, where you're making choices and then owning those choices, and it's a very strange, very disembodied in terms of from the general march of human time position to be in. And I'm not sure too many philosophers ever even like get to that point. I read a lot of philosophy that is clearly ideology. Most of it is, but yeah, it can be used to justify anything, and I think that's the probably das Ding of philosophy to me, is that if you introduce philosophy to any situation, it is an extreme existential threat to whatever ideologically is underpinning that situation, because philosophy will uproot it and show it to itself and show that it's not only right but also wrong. And yeah.
Excellent. So a few things. First off, I do love how now on Instagram there are people taking videos and pictures to prove that they're chilling most best. I am optimizing my chilling right now. Look at me taking pictures. Just play hard, play hard, relax hard. And there's like a competition to see who chills the best. That really tells you everything you need to know.
There's like there's been frolicking competitions. Have you seen that on TikTok?
No, I have not seen frolicking competition.
It's mostly like urban dudes, like black dudes are all like, I'm frolicking, yeah, but it's good shit.
No, it just goes to show you, well, precisely because thought is unbound. Philosophy can be about anything, and it can be a kind of ability to turn. Philosophy can take any leisurely act or anything and make it a competition. I can turn leisure into a competition. I can make everything into the ethical. And really, the deepest philosophy, like philosophy is not merely, the choice. To me, you have to go through philosophy, and this is where philosophy is necessary. Philosophy is necessary for the absolute choice, which I think is what you're describing, which is the groundless choice where you choose your own ground and you can't rely on anything external, like an ethical standard. And that's why I was taught, like with Nietzsche, there's no bestow it. You can't have the standard of choice be bestowed to you. It has to be in the paradoxical bothness, which sucks, but that's what it's required. And if you simply, and you mentioned the Bhagavad Gita, what's so critical with that, and it's very similar to Job, is Arjuna is stuck between his karma and dharma. Does he serve his duty, which is to his family, or his karma, which is to serve like Krishna, basically? And he cannot have both. This is why basically a philosophy that's not tragic is useless, tragedy being a trade-off of competing goods, because if you can have situations where the choice is absolute, it is simply the absolute choice, Well, that is an entirely different choice than choosing either karma or dharma. And of course, how does the Bhagavad Gita resolve this? Krishna basically turns into his multi-form and says, shut up and do what I tell you. I'm sorry. No different than Job, right? God shows up and he's like, who are you? Okay. Well, now if you don't believe in God, you're stuck between the karma and the dharma. You can't rely on a deus ex machina. This is the key. All of the great like religious tensions that you're describing basically dealt with it by having a deus ex machina. God comes in and says, I was here before creation. What do you know? Krishna's like, 1,000 blazing suns, baby. Okay, I'll do what you said. Well, now you can't have the deus ex machina. So now it's the absolute choice without any deus ex machina to save you from the absolute choice. And that's what philosophy has to unveil to you, prepare you for, and then go from there, which is very, very difficult. And if you take that seriously, then you're going to look to suboptimize and you're going to look to leisure because you're not going to be eager to make choices. You're not going to be eager to actually do it precisely because it's such a big deal. And that might help lead people, like you were saying, if everyone were to do nothing, everything would be fine, right? Like if everyone were to do nothing, everyone would be fine. Well, if they took choice more seriously, then actually there may be less doing in a positive way. There'd actually be more sort of optimizing, sub-optimization per se, precisely because you are not choosing within the need to always be making choices. Because actually, in a real sense, if you're not making an absolute choice, you're not even making a choice. You're simply following an ethic, following what capitalism told you to do, following what the Republican Party would have you do. It seems like a choice, but actually you're choosing within a preset framework, so it's not a deep choice. Philosophy unveils to you that no, a true choice is this absolute deep choice, and so maybe you ought to slow down a little bit. Maybe you ought to like take your time and not be so eager, because literally every choice you make can start something. So why don't we sub-optimize a little more? I think really if you take seriously the depths of choice, you will naturally become, dare I say, more suboptimal as you're describing it in a positive way, because you'll take seriously what it's doing. But those are some thoughts. I'm going to give it to Javier and then Cadell last. So Javier, please.
So lately, the more that I've keep philosophizing or whatever we want to call it, it's funny because more and more in my real life do I encounter more impotent moments. Like I'm like, people are presenting me problems, and I'm like, I don't really know. I don't even know where to begin with this. I don't even know how to answer your question. I don't know how to help you. Like more and more I feel impotent. And people want to, basically suck the optimization out of me. But I wanted to ask Ebert this question. What is your take on the NPC eroticization that is going on, like on TikTok, Instagram? I don't even know if you guys know what I'm referring to when I say that. But I'm curious about, because it would seem like having this sort of NPC behavior that's become eroticized, it would seem like, oh, this is kind of like a sub-optimization, but I know it's not. I know it's not a sub-optimization, but I'm really curious about how you think about that, Ebert.
What is an NPC? What is it?
It's like, so I don't know if you've seen those videos. It's where like basically a good-looking woman comes in. She's like, ice cream, makes a random noise, and she's like, hamburger, whatever. Like she just says like random shit and does random shit, and it's just on a loop. Yeah, ASMR. But it's become eroticized, and people love it and they watch it.
Yeah, jouissance. I mean, to me, yeah. No, I don't know if that is. Yeah, maybe that's. I mean, I don't know. I'd have to think about the suboptimal, optimal. What I would say is that's probably an example of the most highly optimized form of consumption. And that's what we get when we fully optimize, right? We get a sort of inertia, which is basically an enjoyment with a deadly reference, which is death itself, because it's at a full equilibrium. It's non-dynamical. It's the same thing over and over again. It basically just does this one thing where it cuts all the synaptic shortcuts right to your like frame of enjoyment, and there's no deviation. It's just hamburger, and it just does the thing, and that's it, right? Doesn't go here and there, just does the thing. So I'd say that's like fully optimized. And the algorithm is brilliant in filtering out deviations from optimization, and then finally presenting you with fucking hamburger, you know. And so it's not a as a philosopher, you get to even understand, like, oh, there it is. There's a fucking little equilibrium, flat line, sublation moment. It's not good or bad, you know. And that's why, you know, I used to get in fights with Bard about like duration. He'd be like, you know, well, those moments which are essentially sublation are not real. Why? Because they don't last. Well, that doesn't make them not real. Like the person enjoying hamburger on the ASMR of hamburger, like that's perfectly real. The moment of awe is perfectly real. Those moments are moments, and they're not like linear, they're non-linear time. But anyway, yeah, seeing technology is pure optimization, algorithms pure optimization. So we end up with those pieces of consumption that just like hit you. Those are like as fully optimized as we've got so far. Like a 5-second piece. Oh, it's better than Avatar. It's better than The Godfather. It's just this fucking woman eating hamburger over and over. And it's just the most optimized nugget you could possibly, you know, most compressed and condensed. So yeah, it's a good example. And you know, that's why I think it would be interesting to develop technology that's suboptimal. I used to joke that I have a bunch of friends that are like hi-fi addicts, and they're like, oh, we're gonna make this vinyl so good. We're increasing the width of the grooves, and it's gonna be even this frequency and wider. I'm like, yeah, pretty soon you're gonna invent the CD, you know, because like you keep fucking optimizing this thing, you're gonna ruin it. Anyway.
That made me laugh really hard. I will note, I'll visit Cadell quickly, that I think that like literally if you examine the video and they were doing this on Basecamp, like the timing of the eating of the hamburger is all algorithmically perfect. So it is actually a perfect optimized thing, just like Ebert's saying. Like the girl, apparently the one with the ice cream, I don't know if this is true. She's like a 32-year-old businesswoman who's like studied the algorithm and figured out the way to do it to make a whole lot of money, apparently. So yeah, I wonder if today Beethoven's Ninth is actually suboptimal, because no one will be your friend if you listen to classical music. It does make me wonder, like, if something that in the past would be like, oh, that's Beethoven's Ninth, that's as magnificent as it gets, if there's like, that's actually suboptimal today in a sense, and thus liberating. But let me give it to Cadell Last. Mr. Cadell Last.
You said a philosophy that is tragic. Sorry, a philosophy that is not tragic is useless. And I totally agree with that. But I just wanted to get your perspective, or also to note that at the end of What is Sex, Alenka emphasizes that a tragic love is somewhat dramatic and problematic, whereas she thinks that it should be a tragedy which points towards comedy. What do you think about that? And should we have this tragedy pointing towards comedy in philosophy as well?
Oh, I think that's a very good point. Like, you have this issue where if tragedy is tragedy for tragedy's sake, if you're just Arjuna standing between karma and dharma and you never make a choice, well, there's a tragedy, but there's never any comedy. And comedy, like commedia from Dante, is like a process. It's a journey. Like, it's not necessarily just laughter. There is a kind of laughter because it tends to be ironic, but it also has a kind of journey to it. Tragedy must always... Here's the thing, like a true choice, which is made from a tragic place, ergo no pre-existing intention, must be the beginning of an intention. So when I say that philosophy without tragedy is useless, that is not to say that it is just tragic. It has to start in the place of what Ebert is saying of not having a preset notion, because then it's just like politics or something, right? It's not actually philosophy. So it starts tragic, and then the comedy from that can begin. Your start is like, oh my gosh, there is no ground for the choice between dharma and karma. What does it mean that there's no choice between the ground between dharma and karma? And now you're going on a journey. Now you're engaging in speculative reason. So likewise with love, it's like, oh my gosh, we can never bridge the difference between our different interpretations of situations. What does it mean that we can't bridge the difference between our differences of interpretation? How do we live together? Then you go on a journey of existing in that space to arrive at something that you otherwise could have never arrived at. So I think that's a very fair point that Alenka is getting at.
I just want to add one more thing that I really like Javier's point that he's made several times about love. when he says love is not your choice. You sort of deal with the horror of falling in love. And I'd be interested to know what you guys think about that. And that seems like an interesting thing to think about love and choice. This seems just like an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, I will note I love like Thomas Merton, I think in his notebooks, Dancing on Water or something, has this part where he's like, we talk about love today, like falling in love as if you're drunk at a party and you're going by the swimming pool and there's no water in it and you trip and you fall into it. He's like, that notion of like love as being falling in love can have danger to it, but there also seems to be truth, right? You just going along and then bam, there's a certain apprehension that captures you. So there seems to be a ditch where it's like falling in love, but then you never have the kind of mediation come in to turn that fall into standing. But then there's a kind of like, I'm going to force love, dang it. I'm going to force it to come through. That seems problematic. So that may speak to the need to be suspended between of like, there's the absolute choice, but then something kind of catches you to force the absolute choice that comes in. So that's curious. But Mr. Javier Rivera.
No, I love this question from Cadell, because this is something that I'm like currently going through. And it's kind of funny looking at it from the girl that has become progressively more involved in my life. And the reason why I keep saying these statements is because it's true. Like, it legitimately, you cannot, it's a tragic event, because both of us could not have ever anticipated what was happening. My attraction to her was never there. It wasn't there until it got pointed out by one of my friends, like, why don't you pursue this girl, this woman. And then all of a sudden I broke down some notions about her age, and I instantly became attracted to her. Like, now I can't even help myself, right? But what's really funny and tragic about the whole thing is how she constantly resists the irrational logic of it all, because it just doesn't make any sense, right? She's a woman that got divorced. She thinks that she should be in this pit of just like, misery. Let me fall into my my pessimism about love. And then all of a sudden you encounter this dude and he's like, hey, what's up? And she's like, not now. I don't want you to be near me, basically. And yet ever since I confessed, all we've ever done is get progressively closer. And it's such a hilarious interaction of just like, you can't stop this black hole, baby. It's the Das Ding. It's the Das Ding. Not even I know if it's guaranteed or not. But it's just hilarious to me that it's evolved into this thing of just like, now I have like a pet name for her and she has a pet name for me, and yet we're not in anything. And what's hilarious, and Cadell, you're gonna like this point. You're gonna like this point a lot. There was a girl that decided to leave a note on my computer, and she called me like Boo Bear or something, right? And ever since then, Kat, this is the girl that I'm talking about, she decided to use that as the pet name for me. But she decided to disguise it in a way that's like, haha, this name's funny. But really, the only person that uses it is her. That's the only person that uses it. It's her that uses it. And so it just cracks me up that it's this black hole. She's resisting. I'm surprised that it's happening. And we both don't know what's going to happen. We have no idea. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there.
Isn't the whole point of being in love that there's no choice? Isn't that the whole attraction?
All I know is that I want
That scene of the bomb going off in Oppenheimer and having Javier's laugh overlaid with it. That's all I know, is the bomb's going off and Javier's laugh is going. Let me give it to Cadell.
I just want to say quickly, because it connects the very end of What is Sex. Not only does she conclude about the comedy thing, but she also has a very, very simple solution. Like, she has all this very complex text about what is sex. And then she just says, oh, the solution is the contingency of a nickname. She just says it's the contingency of a nickname. Here's the specific wording, with a comic sparkle. Isn't that like, it's just like fire?
Is that what Oppenheimer needed? A nickname with a little sparkle? Oppie? He just needed Oppie. If he would have gotten Oppie, he wouldn't have fricking built the atom bomb. It all came down to him, no one calling him Oppie. So here we are, 2023, the world coming to an end. It's also very curious. I know we've talked about it before, that humans naturally create nicknames when they're in love. And it's almost like there's a certain like separation naming. We have a special, there's a zone here of the unknown. And if the Das Ding is a zone, you know, the naming kind of traces out a certain zone of the unknown and the unexpected. And I think what Ebert's saying too is like the whole point of love. There is something weird with love where it's unplanned and unexpected, but then there's obviously questions of what is unexpected, and like what unexpected occurs because of previous choices and conditioning you've gone through. Because you did football, you know, because you did football, philosophy, you did X, Y, and Z, the person that you fall in love with without choice is Sarah, not Jane. You know, there can be a high order complexity that's part of it, which makes it this weird mixture of something you choose, but you don't know that you're setting up to fall in love with this person when you choose to do football or something, right? Because you're conditioning yourself for something you don't choose to occur. And I think that's starting to get at something that philosophy is aware of. Like, philosophy tends to be an awareness that you are always making yourself a person that is susceptible to things happening to you that you don't choose, that are of the nature of X instead of Y, because you engaged in those choices, that then conditions you to fall into something that otherwise you would not fall into. If you take that, and so you're always kind of, you're always being the ground of the unchosen things that occur to you. Like, you are kind of the absolute ground of those things, not an ethical principle, not a reason, oh, I love you because your skin's pretty or something. Then they'd slap you. It's like, but you are the kind of ground that makes the unexpected occur or something choose you. And if you know that, well, then you sure as heck are going to make sure to suboptimize and to engage in leisure so that the things that you fall for don't pull you deeper into the system or the capture or the things that are trying to control you. You want to condition yourself that the things that unexpectedly happen to you are not things that lead to your capture. But that would require philosophy to then problematize the problems, to carve out that clearing, to carve out that leisure, to carve out that space, which is really, really hard because everyone's telling you you're wasting your life. And you go, exactly. It's very hard to tell people exactly in that circumstance. One must die to live, right? But Mr. Javier Rivera, please, as we come up on the close, I have another 15 minutes. I appreciate everyone being here today so we could talk about sex, death, and Javier's love life. Javier, you actually need to lay down on the bed if we're going to talk down a little more. I'll get a notebook.
So isn't that the paradoxical situation, though, that we didn't make a choice? Love doesn't let us make a choice. But then we get in this Oppenheimer situation where we have to take responsibility for that cause of reaction, right? Where that becomes a sort of ironic choice where it's like, I'm responsible for the thing that I didn't even know I got sucked in. You know, like it's so vacuous, you know, it's such a black hole that's like, now you're telling me to be responsible for my black hole. And I can't conceptualize that. But then also, I think this actually makes a really ironic twist on love, maybe in my opinion. I'm willing for this to be challenged, where it's actually when we start thinking that choice, when we start thinking that love was a choice, is actually when we start destroying it, destroying all of our relations, actually. And that'd be something interesting to think through, because I'm thinking about like when people sort of have this nostalgia about like, well, remember when you like used to dress up for me and like do all this stuff and we were in love and all this stuff. And so it's like this kind of blame back and forth about, we made decisions that made us fall in love. But actually, no, you didn't. You're already like sucked in it. And so it does seem like the only way to answer love properly is through kind of, I'm going to play on Ebert's language, a responsibility of sub-optimization, if that makes any sense. Of course, I don't know what the fuck that would look like, but, you know, I feel like that's like the Das Ding of love, where I'm like, what do I do with this black hole that keeps wanting to break through?
I'll give it to Cadell and Mr. Ebert. It's interesting because if I like choose to go to Food Line and someone there punches me in the face, and so it's like, well, it's your fault. You chose to go there. It's like, yes, no. There's this weird thing where you're choosing but not choosing at the same time. That has a paradoxical character. But does the awareness of that change you in how you respond? So does the emphasis get on the response? But let me give it on Cadell and Mr. Ebert. Cadell, please.
I just want to say quickly, I remembered something Javier said earlier about speed not letting us feel the weight of things. It was actually related to Love Is Not Your Choice, I think, as well, and the horror of falling in love. But he also said speed that is non-corporeal, speed itself. And I was thinking that's a really interesting way to think about capture on the internet. Like capture on the internet is like speed that is non-corporeal, speed itself, like scrolling. People get caught in scrolling loops, just speed itself, non-corporeal. But I'll hopefully hopefully this makes sense. I don't know if I'm making it too complex, but I'm thinking about this love as a black hole. And Javier was saying, I think, responsibility for this thing that I can't get out of anyway. I was thinking, can you get out? What would happen if you get out? Can you get out? And I was thinking about this thing I bring up in Systems and Subjects about information loss and black holes. So like the big thing Stephen Hawking was known for is this paradox of is information preserved or lost on the inside of black holes? It's called the information loss paradox. It always makes me think about like the stakes are basically will all the information of the universe be lost at the end of time and stuff like that. And it seems to involve, of course, this quantum gravity of contingency and necessity. And I was thinking this is a really good way also to think about love as a contingent necessity. This is Zizek plays a lot with this. But the thing is if you do find yourself in this black hole, it's like, what is it? It's like, do you have if you get out I'm trying to, again, I'm wondering, I think I'm making it too complex. I think I'm trying to think something I can't even think. I'm trying to think, is it like a death or an information loss if you do get out? I guess let's I just think like if your partner dies, for example, might be another way to think about it. I don't know. Is there a type of information loss that happens here? I think I'm not making any sense now, but thank you.
You're making perfect sense. Because the black hole, the loss of information is actually formed by a compression of too much information. And so it's again this like excess produces the absence. And so yeah, what you lose is everything, which was nothing, which was the nothingness of everything. And that's why walking away from those things is so brutal, because you lose nothing. You lose that fucking compression, which is totalizing. And yeah, it's you lose the black hole, which is the opposite of nothingness. It's literally so much fucking density of information and love that it appears as nothing, that it has the qualitative nothingness where you're literally mindless. It's the unconscious. But you know, I just wanted to say that total aside, they solved the information paradox, which happens to be that there are echo pieces of data that are reflected off at the
No information. He got sucked in a black hole. This would be a loss of information, actually. Oh, frick, the phone died. So information paradox was solved. That's great. Hi, Michelle. We're talking about love as a black hole. Nukes, Oppenheimer, sex and death and stuff. It's lovely, really. But it's interesting too. I was going to comment, like, as Boothby was saying, that small talk kind of separates you from like mediating the DOS-ing. It's almost like technology, speed, and scrolling can do the same, right? Like, is like the DOS thing. I do wonder, like, if the DOS thing is the unknown, like your own health kind of is that too. Like your health can be like, oh, I have cancer. Oh, I'm sick. Oh gosh, like this kind of unknown that comes out in yourself. And it's interesting to think of like technology, or like you're saying, you're in a car, you don't encounter the reality of your body not being as fit as you thought it was, right? And you can always kind of like avoid that. And there's a way too where I wonder if social media, in making the other fake, also is kind of like the small talk. We say, hey, how you doing? And you're not actually asking. You're just trying to kind of push away the dusting. Likewise, oh, look, I have friends. I have friends. No, you don't. But it looks like you do. So you're kind of dealing with the dusting that way. In the same way that if you're always moving on to the next thing, you never stay at something long enough to cause you the dusting. And it's almost like love, the horror of love, to use that phrase, is now you can't escape the dusting. Up, yep, now you fell in. Yep, you're gonna have to deal with this unknown zone now. You got captured. You're in this unknown zone. And what is the cause and effect that might occur that you can't simply walk away from, in the same way that you could say leave a store, because now you know you walked away from it. Like, this is kind of the key to me of the dusting. It, in the same with love, is once you have it occur to you, you can no longer be in a world where it didn't occur to you. And so all of your actions have to be seen in light of your relation to that thing that occurred to you, right? You fell in love, you now have a deep feeling for this person, and if you just don't call them, you cannot be the person who didn't call them. Like, you now are always confronted with new choices within that horizon that thrust itself upon you, right? Like, and this is where philosophy is kind of aware. It's almost like what philosophy is aware of is the slipping into the dusting. This can happen anytime. And if all you do is think in terms of choice as A or B, C, I chose to do C instead of D, well, that entirely leaves out the thing that can occur that completely changes the horizon of choices that you're making. And if you're not ready for that to occur, you can have a neurotic response. You can psychologically break down in response to that, and you'll probably make bad choices. And so leisure is kind of aware that this can occur, so tread lightly. Because when it does occur, you want to do it well, and if you don't do it well, you can have certain problems. So it's like the dusting has some sort of thing where it changes the entire set of choices you can make. And it happens out of nowhere. Like, it changes the quality of all of your choices. And it's out of nowhere. And you didn't ask for this. It just kind of happened to you. And that's, to me, where in the philosophy of right, when Hegel is suggesting, the way I describe it, he's like, freedom has to be found in choosing your determinations, thus making them necessities for your freedom. You take responsibility for things that are not your fault. That's the only way to be free. Is taking responsibilities, choosing to be responsible for things that are not your fault. That is where freedom is found. And that's the correct response to the dusting, which you could argue that Oppenheimer doesn't do. Oppenheimer never actually chooses to take responsibility for the dusting. He's never taking responsibility for something that's not his fault, because he can always say, well, I didn't know that the Russians would get it. I didn't know all of these things would occur. But rather than take responsibility for that and face the dusting, he instead frames himself as a martyr and thus can kind of avoid it. And it's not his fault. But then it kind of ends with an awareness of, I've unleashed possibly the dusting, and thus you have the image of the end of the world. But let me give it to Javier, please. In the last 13 minutes, let me give it to Javier.
So yes, I want to talk about this in the Oppenheimer relation, because even though we can't really we're sort of helpless with the black hole, right? And thinking about this dusting, there's something that the woman says, the sort of the first woman that Oppenheimer falls in love with, and you can link this to how the walking away becomes brutal when she looks at him and she goes, I thought you said if I called, you'd always answer, right? This destroys him. This destroys Oppenheimer. And you see that when he's literally in a fetal position. It leaves him in a fetal position when he finds out that she's died. Okay? That's how brutal that walking away was. And so it makes me think that maybe the only choice that love leaves us with as a black hole is that it just simply wants us to answer when it calls. I don't know what that even looks like in terms of, is it right? Is it wrong? But it's the fact that it's the responsibility for you to answer when it calls. And yeah, I'm obviously, this is the boomer coming out of me. Can't hide the real coming out right now.
anyways, damn, I got snitched on so hard. But anyways, yeah, I mean, I don't, I really feel like that's kind of what it is. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, get this boy's got his booba quote, but apparently his booba bear. Is it booba bear? Booba bear. Obviously, that's such a great nickname because it's bringing your like freaking boober and bear and it's love. It's just a perfect nickname for you, Javier. It really is booba bear, booba bear. So it's very interesting because so there's another thing that comes to mind where, again, I've been very interested with the base camp, and they, you know, something when you study Japan, there's like, and there's collapsing testosterone, right? There's like collapsing testosterone levels all around the world. This as well, and it has like literal biological consequences. Like you see, genitals are formed differently. It's like very, very real, and it seems to also change sexual attraction in quite profound ways. And that's where you see the ice cream, oh, ice cream. There's something like, you know, for base camp, what they were saying that I thought was very interesting is this is suggestions of a new sexual orientation. And they weren't saying it was bad or good. They were just saying that when you have low testosterone men, this might be actually what they're attracted to because they're actually not so attracted to females. And one of the things is I wonder, is lower testosterone a way to avoid dusting? Like, is it actually kind of setting you up biologically to be in less situations to deal with dusting? And so what that kind of ends up doing is you actually have, if you have a society, let's put it this way. If you have a society of people that are doing everything in their power to avoid dusting, right? Or not that they're doing it intentionally, maybe they're just using the phone more often, right? Like, so therefore they're avoiding the real. They're always at work, so they're not at home to encounter relationships, so on and so forth. Well, it wouldn't be a stretch that just evolutionarily, therefore you need less testosterone, right? Because, you know, you're not being attracted to dusting as much. It's not so much of a role. And so it actually works on reproduction to reduce the most natural form. You know, if you just fall in love, you don't expect it. Well, it does definitely seem in Japan that lower testosterone lowers the probability that you're going to just find yourself falling in love, right? Therefore, less likelihood of encountering the dusting is so described. So is it the case that if we have a society that has actually developed mechanisms for avoiding dusting, speed, technology, all of these different things that we've done, that is now working on biology itself to generate less testosterone, because actually we aren't encountering testosterone, which then brings up, you know, you're not encountering dusting, which raises testosterone, therefore you're not reproducing with more testosterone, therefore you will actually have less encounters of dusting. And is that a good thing? Maybe that's a good thing. What is lost if you have less dusting? What is gained if you have less dusting? Because that might actually have the world you're going toward if you have lower testosterone rates. Now, that is extremely speculative. All of that may be crazy. But if love and attraction have a lot to do, at least in Javier's life, with dusting, then it would not be nuts to say that less testosterone means less dusting. And what is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Is it actually a loss? That's just a speculative question. I have no idea. I just wanted to talk about testosterone. Anyway, Cadell, please.
I do also think base camp's very interesting. Yeah, just leave that there because I feel like that's a bigger topic than we can approach at the end of the net. But what I wanted to bring up in regards to what you were saying about low testosterone was the question I sort of left Boothby with in the seminar today, before we move to the open questions, about transgenderism and this detour through the other to the self with Das Ding. And is transgenderism avoiding this detour to the other? That's one way of saying it. One way of saying it could be it's an avoidance of it, which is it's an androgenization of oneself. It's an androgenization process as opposed to a sexual difference process, or it's rather turning the sexual difference into an internal dimension, which of course Freud thought was a developmental. He thought it was a type of developmental stunting in some sense. Maybe that's too crude. But I just want to link it there with the Barbie movie, where the Barbie movie literally frames the political situation as men and women cannot, there's a zero-sum competition between men and women. that men and women cannot inhabit the same world together. Like literally the message is not Ken and Barbie are made for each other, which is how they were originally made, Ken and Barbie. It was Barbie telling Ken, well, one, Barbie finding Ken kind of unattractive. And then Barbie telling Ken, you've got to go find your own self away from me.
I mean, if the data on Japan, which again, as you know, gentlemen, I'm always talking about like Japan is basically the future of the West, and I think it's delusion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then the movement to, and there's been a ton of transsexuality. Yes, the canary in the coal mine, exactly. There has been transsexuality in Japan for good and for bad, in movies and shows, in anime for a very long time. It definitely seems to be on the side of the movement toward androgynous, both sexes or being multiple sexes at once, is indeed a way that seems to internalize difference that then leads to isolation. There is a radical amount of people that never leave their apartment. There are not babies. People are not having families. They're at work all the time. They have some of the worst work. Well, what's interesting is you would think that if you got rid of gender or you blurred it, and again, this is not saying that's good or bad. Everything is trade-offs. You would think you'd have less work because people are like, oh, I don't have to take care of a family. Crazy enough, you get more work than ever before, actually. That it looks like sexual difference had a way of kind of containing how much people worked, actually, because they had to have a work-life family balance. And people would assume, oh, if you don't have family, then you won't have work. No, it actually looks like work completely takes over, actually. It's very unexpected. And there's studies now that show in the West that this big unexpected tendency has happened in capitalism where you would have thought that people would work less as they get more wealthy. We've seen a skyrocketing of the amount of hours that people are working today in capitalism. You say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Makes a whole lot of sense if people are trying to avoid Das Ding, which occurs in leisure and occurs in sexual difference, because work is where you can get status and not be seen as avoiding anything. And so it definitely seems to be I am of the opinion that you have a Western cultural movement in all areas, work, religion, gender, relationships, away from encounters of this dusting, precisely because that requires certain resources of the person and character to be able to handle that. Where do people go to get them? Like, Daniel, where are they?
But I think like when the way you're talking about Das Ding, we have to think about the return of the repressed.
Sure.
Because if you avoid Das Ding, it's gonna fucking come back. Like you can't, like, you know, you can avoid it for so long, you know.
Yes.
Do you agree?
I completely agree, because
we're gonna have to have some there's gonna be some major consequences of this avoidance.
So my opinion is what ends up happening, so like with the belonging again to it, when you have long periods of this repression, it's only a matter of time before the electric grid fails. And then everything comes out. It's only a matter of time before the demographic crisis destroys the economy. Like, the question is when the chain reaction goes, when the bomb goes off, like at the end, then stuff speeds up really quickly. You can get by with a whole lot of repression for a really long time until something pokes the condition that allows that repression to occur without butting up against others. This basically is what's going to happen. People repressing their inability to be around difference is all well and good until people are forced to work together because of some event that forces them to work together. Then they find out that they can no longer imagine that they could get along. They can no longer imagine that they were a good person. They can no longer imagine that things would be well. Now, the encounter of difference has arisen. And the response to being forced to admit that you're incapable of something that you were able to believe for so long you were capable of tends to lead to a pathological response. Because now you're thrown in the dosing, now you're forced to confront it. Like, this is why training yourself to have encounters with dosting, encounters with the real, the thwarting desire, is great to do kind of gradually and slowly throughout your life, because then it's like building a muscle. You can handle more and more gradually, maybe never the entire thing, but you can get better and better and better and better at it. It's kind of like, if I'm going to use an economic metaphor, you can take all the debt you want. The more debt you take on, the more fragile you are. And you're all well and good until for some reason you can't pay the interest on the debt, and then everything breaks really fast, right? You've been better off to take small economic downturns gradually as opposed to build up that when there is the economic downturn, it basically explodes, right? It like is going to completely erupt. So this is actually, my ironic take on Oppenheimer would be the following. So the nuclear bomb, the atom bomb, is a result of a failure for Oppenheimer to not release, going back to the thematic command, right? He had to see the experiment through and get it off. The ironic thing is that the nuke seems to make it to where war can't happen, because if war occurs, you're screwed, right? Well, that means the entire world is basically forced in a kind of repressed state, sex without climax, right? And so when you're forced to have sex without climax, there's two things that either occur. One, you start hating sex but lose sexual attraction, which seems to be what we're seeing a lot of people are doing with following testosterone growth, or there's something repressed, and it's probably the case that sexual attraction and can't go down fast enough at the rate of the repression eventually being loosened. And then what happens is eventually the thing occurs that makes all that repression comes out. And that's really dire. Like let's put it this way. The longer you do not encounter Das Ding, the more fragile you are. Like you're more fragile. And if the event occurs that hits you hard, it will probably break you. And the consequences will be quite dire. And that, I do think that's definitely the risk. And that's kind of the chain reaction that's kind of in line that, that's like Oppenheimer ends the movie. I think we did it. I think we did start that chain reaction. That can occur with the repression. And then one day, it's too late.
Well, it's too late over here, guys. So I'm gonna I'm gonna go to bed tonight. So
you're a beautiful soul. Well, thank you, everyone.
Late night thoughts. Thank you for the evening, guys.
Thank you, Cadell. Thank you for everything. Thank you, Javier. I'm glad we could talk about your love life.
That's thing of it all.
Yeah, Frank, it's gonna be the graduate too, Javier Rivera, and people will be like the Boober Bear. Yeah, Boober Bear. That's what it's gonna be called. Boober Bear. I am the destroyer of worlds. Boober Bear. So 1,000 blazing suns. So, gentlemen, thank you for your time. I appreciate it very much. You have a good one.